They say an alpha king never kneels. But here's the truth nobody tells you. When your own pack turns on you, when the throne you bled for becomes a blade at your throat, when the woman you chose over an empire watches you fall, that's when you discover what you're really made of. This isn't a fairy tale. This is survival written in blood and betrayal. So buckle up, because what happens next will shatter everything you think you know about power, loyalty, and the brutal cost of being human in a world built for monsters. Drop a like if you're ready for this, and comment your city so I know my tribe is out there watching. The stench of burning flesh reached Kaelen before the screams did. He stood in the northern watchtower of the Varelion palace, hands gripping the stone ledge hard enough to split knuckles. Below, in the courtyard, 3 nobles hung from iron chains while executioners prepared the torches. The crowd gathered like carrion birds, hungry for blood masked as justice. Lord Theron, the king's former battle commander, spat at the ground. The wet sound echoed in the pre-dawn silence. This is necessary, Kaelen told himself. This is survival. But the words tasted like ash. 10 years. A decade of conquest, calculated violence, and sleeping with one eye open because trust was a luxury dead men afforded. Kaelen had transformed a fractured collection of warring territories into the most feared empire on the continent. He'd done it with steel and strategy, with marriages that were treaties and treaties that were threats. The court called him the Iron Wolf for good reason. Wolves survived by being the apex predator, by making the kill before being killed, by understanding that in nature, mercy was just another word for weakness. Kaelen watched the flames catch, watched grown men scream, felt absolutely nothing, and that emptiness terrified him more than any army ever could. A sharp knock interrupted the moment. Kaelen didn't turn. He knew the rhythm of those knuckles against oak. Lord Malrek entered without waiting for permission. The advisor moved like oil over water, smooth and impossible to pin down. Silver threaded through his dark hair, giving him the appearance of dignity he'd never actually earned. Your Majesty, the southern border reports movement. Norvain's forces are repositioning along the river crossing. Kaelen finally turned. How many? Malrek consulted a leather-bound report. 3,000 infantry, maybe 4. Scouts confirm cavalry support. They're testing our response time. They're testing whether I'm distracted. The advisor's thin smile confirmed what Kaelen already knew. The execution below wasn't just punishment for conspiracy. It was theater. A message to internal enemies that the king remained vigilant, ruthless, focused. Except Kaelen was distracted. Had been for exactly 47 days since she arrived. Your Majesty, Malrek continued, pressing forward into dangerous territory. The council requests your presence. There are matters regarding the treasury and... Tell the council I'll attend when I'm ready. Kaelen's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Until then, they can wait. Malrek bowed, but not before Kaelen caught the flicker of something behind those pale eyes. Calculation, assessment, the look of a man measuring weakness. Careful, old friend. Kaelen stepped closer, invading the space between them. I built this empire recognizing that exact expression. Don't make me wonder if you're wearing it for me. The advisor's face went neutral. Of course not, Your Majesty. I serve only the throne. After Malrek left, Kaelen remained in the tower until the executions finished and the courtyard emptied. The bodies would hang for 3 days as reminder and warning. He'd learned that particular lesson from his father. King Kaelen Draven had been a different kind of monster. Where Kaelen used fear strategically, his father had wielded it like a drunk wielded a club, wildly, excessively, without purpose or restraint. The old king had murdered House Vale on a fortune-teller's prophecy. An entire noble family erased because some mystic claimed their bloodline threatened the throne. Kaelen had been 19 when he inherited that particular sin along with the crown. He'd spent the last decade trying to be different, trying to be better. But standing here watching smoke rise from charred corpses, Kaelen wondered if there was actually any difference at all. The eclipse banquet had been 32 days ago. Kaelen remembered it with the clarity of a blade's edge. The great hall had been transformed into something resembling starlight and expensive desperation. Every noble family from 3 kingdoms had attended, peacocking in silk and jewels while plotting treason behind painted smiles. Standard court politics. Then Lady Seraphine Vale had entered, and the entire room shifted. She wore deep emerald velvet that moved like liquid shadow. Her dark hair was pinned with silver that caught the candlelight, making her seem both present and impossible, like something half-remembered from a dream. But it was her eyes that stopped Kaelen mid-conversation with the Norvain ambassador. Gray, storm-colored, intelligent in a way that suggested she saw through every mask in the room and found them all equally amusing. "Who is that?" Kaelen had asked Lord Theron. "Lady Seraphine Vale," the commander replied. Distant relation to the old house, spent most of her life in the eastern provinces. Recently returned to court. Vale. The name landed like a stone in deep water. House Vale was dead, extinct, erased during his father's purge. Except apparently not entirely. Kaelen watched her navigate the room with practiced grace, accepting introductions and deflecting advances with the kind of skill that came from survival, not breeding. She moved like someone who understood that court was a battlefield, where the weapons were words and the casualties were reputations. When their eyes finally met across the banquet hall, something electric and dangerous passed between them. She didn't look away, didn't blush or smile or perform any of the expected gestures of deference, just held his gaze with an expression that suggested she was conducting her own assessment and finding him interesting. Not intimidated, interesting. That was the moment Kaelen knew she was going to be a problem. He just didn't know how big a problem until later that night, when he found her on the eastern balcony overlooking the city. The empire of Varelion spread below like a jeweled grid of light and shadow. From this height, it looked peaceful, beautiful even. You couldn't see the poverty in the lower districts or hear the soldiers patrolling for curfew violators. You couldn't smell the fear that kept every citizen obedient. From up here, it almost looked like paradise. Seraphine stood at the railing, alone. Palace guards knew better than to interrupt when nobles sought privacy. Kaelen dismissed his own escort with a gesture and approached. Enjoying the view? She didn't startle, didn't turn, just continued staring at the city below. That depends. Does it usually come with the company of kings who execute people before breakfast? Her voice was silk wrapped around steel, soft enough to be mistaken for gentleness, hard enough to draw blood if you weren't careful. Kaelen moved beside her, close enough to smell jasmine and something darker. Those men were traitors. They conspired with Norvain to destabilize the eastern border. Would you prefer I send them home with stern warnings? I'd prefer to know if executing people makes you feel powerful or just helps you sleep at night. The question hit harder than expected. Kaelen studied her profile in the moonlight. She was beautiful in an unconventional way. Sharp angles instead of soft curves, intelligence instead of practiced charm. You're very bold for someone with no army, no title worth mentioning, and no protection beyond my current goodwill. Seraphine finally turned to face him. Is that a threat, Your Majesty? It's an observation. Kaelen stepped closer, testing. Most people fear me. Most people are smarter than I am. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Or maybe I just have less to lose. That caught his attention. Everyone had something to lose. Family, wealth, status, life itself. The art of ruling was understanding exactly what someone valued and leveraging it. What did you lose, Lady Vale? The question hung between them like a blade. Seraphine held his gaze, and for a moment Kaelen saw something ancient and wounded in those storm-colored eyes. Then it disappeared behind practiced neutrality. Everything that mattered. She turned back to the city. But I'm sure you already knew that. Before Kaelen could respond, she walked away, leaving him alone on the balcony with the uncomfortable realization that he'd just been dismissed by a woman with no power, who somehow made him feel like she'd won their encounter. That was 47 days ago. Since then, Seraphine had become a fixture at court. She attended councils, participated in debates, and somehow managed to make every conservative noble deeply uncomfortable while maintaining perfect etiquette. She was brilliant, dangerous, and Kaelen was obsessed. The Council of Ministers met in the Western Wing, a circular chamber designed for acoustics and intimidation. 23 seats arranged in concentric circles, with the king's throne elevated at the center. Kaelen entered to find the usual suspects already assembled. Lord Malrek, representing intelligence and foreign affairs. General Voss, commanding military operations. High Chancellor Yaren managing the treasury. And now, seated in the outer circle wearing that same emerald velvet, Lady Seraphine Vale. She shouldn't be here. Council positions were hereditary or appointed. Seraphine had neither claim nor invitation. Yet there she sat, calmly reviewing documents like she belonged. Your Majesty, High Chancellor Yaren began immediately. The Treasury reports significant shortfalls in the southern provinces. Tax collection has dropped 30% in the last quarter. Because you're squeezing corpses, Seraphine said without looking up. Can't collect taxes from citizens you've starved. The chamber went silent. Kaelen leaned back in his throne, curious to see how this played out. Yaren's face flushed crimson. Lady Vale, you have no authority to address this council, let alone I have eyes and basic arithmetic. Seraphine finally looked up, meeting the Chancellor's glare with perfect calm. Your tax policy is killing productivity in regions that can't afford it. The shortfall isn't mysterious, it's predictable. The southern provinces harbor rebel sympathies, General Voss interjected. Harsh measures are necessary to maintain control. Seraphine turned that steady gaze on the general. Harsh measures create the very rebels you're trying to suppress. You're generating enemies and calling it security. You speak of matters you don't understand, girl. The condescension in Voss's voice made Kaelen's jaw tighten. But before he could intervene, Seraphine stood. I understand perfectly, General. She moved to the center of the circle, somehow commanding the room despite having no formal power. You believe fear creates obedience, that violence equals strength, that ruling through terror makes you invincible. She paused, letting the words settle. But terror is expensive. It requires constant escalation. More executions, more surveillance, more military presence. And every escalation costs gold you don't have and loyalty you can't buy. So tell me, General, when the treasury runs dry and the soldiers stop getting paid, who exactly will fear you then? The silence that followed was absolute. Kaelen watched Seraphine dismantle his entire governing philosophy in under 2 minutes. Watched his council struggle for rebuttals. Watched her stand there, small and unarmed, somehow winning a battle she had no business surviving. And something deep in his chest cracked. Not broke. Just shifted. Enough! Kaelen's voice cut through the tension. Lady Vale makes valid points. Chancellor Yaren, review the southern tax structure. General Voss, provide analysis on alternative security measures that don't require mass executions. Your Majesty, surely you don't intend to... I intend to run an empire that doesn't collapse from internal rot. Kaelen stood, ending the session. We'll reconvene tomorrow. As the council dispersed, Seraphine remained. Kaelen descended from the throne, moving into her space with deliberate intensity. That was reckless. Was it wrong? That's not the point. You challenged military command in open council, made the Chancellor look incompetent, questioned policies that have maintained order for a decade. Seraphine didn't retreat. Then perhaps those policies need questioning. They were alone now. Guards stationed outside, ministers gone, just the two of them in the empty chamber. Kaelen stepped closer, close enough to see the pulse at her throat, to catch that jasmine scent. Do you have any idea how dangerous you are? To whom? Her voice dropped, matching his intensity. To your pride or your power? The question hit like a physical blow, because the terrifying truth was both. Seraphine threatened everything Kaelen had built his identity around. The belief that strength required distance, that leadership demanded fear, that love was weakness and attachment was suicide. She made him want things he'd killed inside himself years ago. Things like trust, like connection, like being seen as a man instead of a crown. You should be careful, Lady Vale. Kaelen's voice came out rougher than intended. This court destroys people who forget their place. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something. And what if I'm not interested in staying in my place? The air between them turned electric. Kaelen could smell her skin, could see the slight tremor in her breathing. One step closer, and he could... Your Majesty, a guard called from the doorway. Urgent message from the northern border. The moment shattered. Kaelen stepped back, reassembling the mask of absolute control. What is it? Norvain has crossed into our territory. 3 villages burned. They're claiming it was in response to our military buildup. Seraphine's expression shifted from challenge to concern. Did they mention casualties? The guard hesitated. Over 200 dead, my lady. Mostly civilians. She went pale. Kaelen turned to his captain. Mobilize the northern legions. Send word to Lord Theron that I want full tactical assessment by dawn. And increase palace security. If Norvain is making aggressive moves, they might have allies inside our walls. After the guard left, Kaelen found Seraphine staring at nothing. Are you all right? Those people died because of me. Her voice was barely audible. Because I questioned your military policy in open council. Because Norvain thought you were weak enough to... Stop. Kaelen caught her arm, forcing her to look at him. Norvain has been planning this for months. Your speech didn't trigger anything except my own doubts. She blinked. Your doubts? Kaelen released her, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. About whether fear is actually enough. For the first time since meeting her, Seraphine looked genuinely surprised. Then footsteps echoed in the corridor. Lord Malrek appeared slightly out of breath. Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but we've received intelligence from our agents in Norvain. They're not just testing borders. This is the beginning of a full invasion. Kaelen's blood went cold. How long do we have? A week? Maybe less if they force march. Seraphine stepped forward. What resources do they have? Malrek glanced at Kaelen for permission before answering. 20,000 soldiers, naval support from the eastern kingdoms, and according to our sources, they have detailed intelligence about our defensive positions. Someone is feeding them information, Kaelen said flatly. It would appear so, Your Majesty. The three of them stood in the council chamber, surrounded by maps and strategies, and the growing realization that everything was about to collapse. Kaelen looked at Seraphine. You should leave the palace. Go somewhere safe. Safe from what? From Norvain or from you? The question stung because it was fair. Kaelen had spent 10 years building an empire on fear and calculated violence. He'd convinced himself it was necessary. That cruelty was the price of survival. That being loved made you vulnerable, but being feared made you invincible. But standing here with invasion imminent and betrayal lurking in every shadow, Kaelen realized the terrible truth. Fear didn't make you invincible. It just made you alone. And alone was exactly how you died. I need to prepare for war, Kaelen said, already moving toward the door. Lord Malrek, summon the War Council. I want every general, every commander, every... Your Majesty. Seraphine's voice stopped him. What if there's another way? He turned. What do you mean? What if instead of preparing for war, you prepared for alliance? The suggestion was so unexpected that Kaelen actually laughed. Alliance with Norvain, Setre, Itre? They just burned 3 of our villages. Because they're scared. Seraphine moved closer, urgency replacing her usual calm. They're not invading because they're strong. They're invading because they think you're planning to invade them first. It's preemptive violence driven by fear. Which is exactly what I would do, Kaelen admitted. I know. She held his gaze. Because you've taught the entire continent that power is the only language you speak. But what if you spoke differently? Malrek cleared his throat. My lady, with respect, diplomatic overtures at this stage would be interpreted as weakness or as strength. Seraphine didn't break eye contact with Kaelen. Real strength. The kind that doesn't need constant war to prove itself. The kind his father never had. The kind Kaelen wasn't sure he possessed. Before he could respond, an explosion rocked the palace. The concussive force threw all 3 of them to the ground. Stone dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere distant, screams echoed through marble corridors. Kaelen was on his feet instantly, pulling Seraphine up. Are you hurt? I'm fine. What was... Another explosion. Closer this time. The palace was under attack. Guards flooded into the chamber, forming protective circles. Captain Draven appeared, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. Your Majesty, we're breached. Southern gate demolished. Attackers are flooding into the lower levels. How many? Kaelen was already moving, Seraphine close behind. Unknown. They're wearing civilian clothes. Could be insurgents. Could be Norvan operatives. Could be anyone, Kaelen finished. Because he'd made so many enemies he couldn't track them all. We need to get you to the safe rooms, Captain Draven insisted. No. Kaelen drew his sword, the weight familiar and terrible in his hand. We need to defend the palace, sound the alarm, mobilize every available soldier, and someone find General Voss. Your Majesty, please. Seraphine grabbed his arm. You can't just, I can't hide while my palace burns. Kaelen looked at her, really looked at her, memorizing the fear and frustration and something else in those storm-colored eyes. Stay with the guards. They'll protect you. And who will protect you? The question hung in the air between explosions and screaming. Kaelen didn't have an answer. He just turned and ran toward the chaos, leaving Seraphine behind because that was what kings did. They ran toward danger. They faced threats head-on. They chose the Empire over everything else, even over the one person who made them want to choose differently. The southern corridors were carnage. Bodies littered the marble floors. Guards, servants, attackers all mixed together in pools of spreading blood. Smoke choked the air. Fires consumed tapestries worth kingdoms. Kaelen fought like a man possessed. His sword found throats, hearts, arteries. He moved on instinct, on training, on the muscle memory of violence that never really left. But for every attacker he killed, two more appeared. They were organized, professional. This wasn't random insurgency. This was coordinated military action. Your Majesty, General Voss appeared from a side corridor, surrounded by his own guard. We need to evacuate. This is a full-scale assault. Who? Kaelen demanded, running his blade through another masked attacker. Who is doing this? Voss hesitated just a fraction too long, and in that hesitation Kaelen saw the truth. The general knew, had known, might have even helped plan it. Before Kaelen could act on that revelation, Lord Malric stumbled into view, clutching his side where blood seeped between his fingers. Your Majesty, he gasped. It's worse than we thought. The attack isn't just military. Half your noble houses have joined the rebellion. They're claiming you're unfit to rule. On what grounds? Kaelen demanded. Malric's eyes flicked to something behind Kaelen. On the grounds that you've become compromised by foreign influence. Kaelen turned, and there stood Seraphine, surrounded by guards, exactly where he'd left her. Except now he saw her through different eyes, saw how conveniently she'd appeared at court, how perfectly she'd inserted herself into councils, how easily she'd challenged his policies and made him doubt his own judgment, saw how completely he'd let his guard down for a woman whose entire family he'd supposedly destroyed. Lady Vale, Malric's voice carried across the burning corridor, filled with false sympathy. Perhaps you'd like to explain to His Majesty who you really are? Seraphine's face went pale, and Kaelen felt his entire world crack in half, because the woman he'd chosen over empire, the woman who made him want to be better, the woman standing there with truth written all over her face, that woman was about to confirm his worst fear, that love wasn't just weakness, it was betrayal wrapped in jasmine and storm-colored eyes, and he'd fallen for it completely. The smoke between them felt heavier than the stone walls crumbling around the palace. Kaelen's sword was still dripping blood from the last attacker he'd killed. His chest heaved with exertion and something far more dangerous than physical exhaustion. Behind him, guards formed defensive positions while fires consumed priceless tapestries. The sounds of battle echoed through marble corridors that had stood for 3 centuries, but all of it faded into background noise. Because right now the only thing that mattered was the woman standing 15 feet away, wearing guilt like a second skin. Seraphine's face had gone the color of ash. Her hands trembled at her sides. Those storm-colored eyes that had challenged him, intrigued him, made him question everything he'd built. Those eyes now carried the weight of confirmation. Lord Malric stood between them, still clutching his bleeding side but somehow managing to look triumphant despite the injury. Well, Your Majesty? The advisor's voice carried false sympathy. Aren't you curious about Lady Vale's true purpose at court? Kaelen didn't move, didn't lower his weapon, just stared at Seraphine with the kind of focus that had won him a dozen battles. When you interrogate a prisoner, you learn to read the space between truth and lies. The micro-expressions that betray intention, the way breath catches when someone's weighing how much to reveal. Seraphine wasn't weighing anything. She'd already decided. My family didn't die in rebellion, she said quietly. Her voice cut through the chaos with eerie clarity. They were murdered, executed without trial on the order of King Kaelen Draven. Your father killed every member of House Vale except me. I was 6 years old. They hid me with servants before the soldiers came. Kaelen felt something cold settle in his chest. I know what my father did. Do you? Seraphine's composure cracked slightly. Do you know that my mother begged for mercy while they dragged her to the gallows? That my father died trying to protect siblings I can barely remember? That I grew up in poverty, hiding my real name, watching from the shadows while you built an empire on the graves of my family? The truth hung between them like a blade. General Voss shifted position, hand moving toward his weapon. Several guards followed suit. The entire corridor had become a pressure cooker of violence waiting for the slightest spark. So you came for revenge, Kaelen said flatly. Everything. The debates, the councils, the conversations on balconies, all of it was manipulation. No. The word came out sharp. Then Seraphine hesitated, and that hesitation told Kaelen everything. It started that way. I came to expose you, to prove that the great Alpha King was just another tyrant drunk on power, to destroy your credibility from within and watch your empire collapse. Malrek smiled. And you succeeded beautifully, my dear. Half the noble houses are in open rebellion. Norvain has invaded. The palace is burning. Your Majesty, she's been feeding intelligence to your enemies for months. Is that true? Kaelen's voice came out dangerously quiet. Seraphine met his eyes. Yes. The single word hit harder than any weapon. Because here's what nobody tells you about betrayal. It's not the act itself that destroys you. It's the moment you realize you saw it coming and chose to ignore every warning sign because you wanted to believe in something beyond survival. Kaelen had known she was dangerous from the first conversation, had recognized the intelligence, the strategic mind, the way she maneuvered through court politics with the skill of someone who'd spent years planning. He'd known, and he'd let her in anyway. That was the real failure, not being betrayed, but betraying himself by wanting something he'd sworn off a decade ago. Your Majesty, General Voss stepped forward. We need to execute her immediately. Make an example before the rebellion spreads further. Wait, Malrek interjected smoothly. Perhaps Lady Vale could be useful. A hostage to negotiate with the rebel houses, or bait to draw out the conspirators. She's bait either way, Voss growled. Better to cut our losses and— Enough! Kaelen's voice silenced them both. He moved closer to Seraphine, closing the distance until he could see the rapid pulse at her throat, could smell jasmine mixed with smoke and fear. Up close, he saw something that didn't fit the narrative of calculated betrayal. Her hands were shaking, not from fear of execution. Kaelen had seen enough people face death to recognize that particular terror. This was different. This was the tremor of someone caught between conflicting truths. Tell me the rest, he said quietly. Because you're leaving something out. Seraphine's jaw tightened. What makes you think there's more? Because you're a terrible liar when it actually matters. Kaelen studied her face the way he'd studied battle maps. You said it started as revenge. What did it become? For a long moment, she didn't answer. Around them, the palace continued burning. Soldiers fought and died in distant corridors. The empire was collapsing in real time, and Kaelen was standing here demanding emotional honesty from a woman who'd orchestrated his downfall. But he needed to hear it, needed to know if any of it had been real. It became complicated, Seraphine finally whispered. You weren't supposed to be human. You were supposed to be a monster. Easy to hate, easy to destroy. But I'm not? She laughed bitterly. You're worse. You're a monster who knows he's a monster and hates himself for it, who executes traitors at dawn and then stands in towers looking haunted, who rules through fear because you're terrified that anything else will get you killed. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. Seraphine's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. I came here to destroy you, and then I started understanding you, and understanding became the worst kind of betrayal because I couldn't hate what I comprehended. Malrek cleared his throat impatiently. How touching. Your Majesty, while you're having this moment, the palace is actively under siege. He was right. Kaelen could hear the fighting getting closer, could smell the smoke thickening. Every second spent here was a second the empire burned. But empires could be rebuilt. Trust, once shattered, stayed broken forever. Captain Draven appeared at the end of the corridor, armor dented and blood-streaked. Your Majesty, we've secured the eastern wing, but the throne room has been breached. Lord Theron is holding them, but he needs reinforcements. How many attackers? Kaelen asked, not taking his eyes off Seraphine. At least 200 inside the palace. More flooding in through the southern breach. Kaelen made a decision that would have horrified his younger self. The self that trusted no one. The self that survived by assuming everyone was an enemy. Lock Lady Vale in the northern tower. Post guards. No one gets in or out. Your Majesty, Voss protested. She's a confirmed traitor. She should be... She stays alive until I decide otherwise. Kaelin's tone left no room for argument. General, you're with me. We're taking back the throne room. And Lord Malrek? The advisor's voice carried an edge Kaelen had never noticed before. Find whoever's coordinating this attack. Someone inside the palace is opening gates and providing intelligence. I want them identified. Malrek bowed. Of course, Your Majesty. As guards moved to escort Seraphine away, she caught Kaelin's arm. Her touch was electric even through the chaos. Why? She asked. Why not just execute me and be done with it? Kaelen looked at her hand on his arm, at the fingers that had touched him with something resembling gentleness 47 days ago on a balcony overlooking the city. Because you're right, he said quietly. I am a monster who hates being a monster, and killing you would just prove I never learned anything. He pulled away and headed toward the throne room, not looking back, because looking back would mean acknowledging the expression on her face, would mean confronting the possibility that her betrayal and her feelings were somehow both genuine. And Kaelen couldn't afford that kind of complicated truth, not when his empire was burning. The throne room looked like a portrait of civilizational collapse. Bodies littered the polished floors. Blood pooled around the base of the Iron Throne. The massive stained glass windows depicting Varelion's founding had been shattered, letting in smoke and the sounds of the burning city. Lord Theron fought at the center of it all, surrounded by the king's personal guard. The old commander moved like a man half his age, sword work precise and brutal. But he was vastly outnumbered. Kaelen hit the battle like a storm. His sword found the nearest attacker's spine, dropping him instantly. Spun left, blocked an overhead strike, drove his blade through exposed ribs. Moved forward, always forward, cutting through the insurgents with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd been trained for war since childhood. General Voss and his soldiers joined the fight, crashing into the attackers from the side. The throne room became a meat grinder of steel and screaming. Kaelen fought his way to Theron, matching the commander's defensive position. Took you long enough? The old warrior grunted, parrying a spear thrust. I was busy. Kaelen blocked a sword aimed at Theron's blind spot. Who are they? Mix of everything. Soldiers, nobles, common insurgents. Someone promised them the palace would fall tonight. Someone was well informed. Kaelen drove his boot into an attacker's knee, feeling bone shatter. Any idea who's leading them? Theron pointed with his bloodied sword toward the throne itself. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the firelight streaming through broken windows. Tall, armored, holding a sword that looked expensive enough to ransom a province. When the figure turned, Kaelin's blood went cold. It was Lord Caius Heron, one of his oldest allies, a noble who'd supported Kaelin's ascension to the throne, who'd fought beside him in 3 separate campaigns. Your Majesty, Caius called out over the din of battle. So good of you to join us. Kaelen wiped blood from his face. Caius. Should have known. Should you have? The noble descended from the throne platform, his soldiers parting to let him through. I was loyal for 10 years, bled for your empire, believed in your vision of strength through unity. And now? Now I realize your vision was always just tyranny with better marketing. Caius raised his sword. You've become exactly what your father was, a despot drunk on power, surrounded by fear and corpses. The accusation stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. So what's your alternative? Kaelen gestured at the burning throne room. This? Rebellion and chaos? How many people died tonight for your vision of better governance? Fewer than will die if you remain on the throne. Caius moved closer, his soldiers forming a circle around them. Seraphine was right. Fear can't sustain an empire forever. Eventually it collapses under its own weight. Hearing her name from Caius's mouth felt like a physical blow. She's working with you. She opened our eyes to what you really are. Caius smiled coldly. A king so terrified of being vulnerable that he'd rather burn the world than admit he might be wrong. Behind Kaelen, Theron muttered a warning. more soldiers flooding in from the eastern corridor. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and fighting in an enclosed space that limited their tactical options. Kaelen did the mental calculation, assessed exits, counted enemies, evaluated whether he could actually win this fight. The answer was no, not through direct combat. But Kaelen hadn't built an empire by fighting fair. "General Voss," Kaelen called out, "the northern passages, are they still secure?" "Last I checked, yes." "Then we're retreating. All units fall back to secondary positions. Theron, you're with me." Caius laughed. "Running, Your Majesty? How very unalpha of you." Kaelen met his eyes across the burning throne room. "It's called strategy, Caius. Something you'd understand if you'd ever actually won a war instead of just talking about revolution in council meetings." Then he turned and ran, not away from the fight, toward survival. Because here's what separates kings from corpses: knowing when to retreat, understanding that losing a battle isn't the same as losing a war, recognizing that your ego is worth less than your continued existence. Kaelin's father had never learned that lesson, died in his throne room fighting enemies he could have negotiated with, too proud to admit that sometimes the smart move is stepping back. Kaelen refused to make the same mistake. They retreated through the northern passages, a maze of servant corridors and hidden routes that only the royal family knew. Behind them, Caius's forces gave chase but fell behind in the unfamiliar territory. "Your Majesty," Theron gasped as they ran, "where exactly are we going?" "The northern tower." Kaelen vaulted over a collapsed section of wall. "We regroup there, assess our forces, and figure out who's still loyal. And if no one is, then we die in a more defensible position." The truth was, Kaelen didn't know how bad the betrayal ran. Caius had been one of his most trusted allies. If he'd turned, how many others had followed? How much of the nobility was actively fighting against the throne? How much of this was Seraphine's influence versus genuine discontent? They reached the northern tower to find it still under royal control. Captain Draven had established a defensive perimeter with about 50 soldiers. Not much against the hundreds Kaelen had seen in the throne room, but it was something. "Your Majesty," Draven saluted, "the tower is secure. Lady Vale is in the upper chamber under guard." "How's she doing?" The question came out before Kaelen could stop it. Draven exchanged glances with Theron. "Quiet, sir. Haven't heard anything from her since we locked the door." Kaelen nodded, trying to ignore the part of him that wanted to go upstairs and demand more answers. More truth. More of whatever existed between betrayal and the complicated feeling that made his chest ache every time he thought about Jasmine and storm-colored eyes. General Voss arrived minutes later with another 30 soldiers. All told, they had maybe 80 fighters, loyal fighters, against an entire rebellion. Theron spread maps across a table someone had dragged into the tower's lower chamber. "The strategic situation is catastrophic. We've lost the throne room, the southern wing, most of the palace grounds. Caius has fortified the central plaza. Norvain's forces are less than 2 days from the capital." "What about our armies?" Kaelen demanded. "The northern legions? The eastern garrisons?" Voss looked uncomfortable. "Communication has been sporadic. It's possible the rebellion has spread beyond the capital. Multiple commanders may have defected. Or they're waiting to see who wins," Theron added grimly. The reality settled over Kaelen like ice water. This wasn't just a coup attempt. This was coordinated, well-planned, and supported by a significant portion of his own power structure. The empire wasn't just cracking, it was actively breaking apart. "Your Majesty." Malrek appeared in the doorway, looking worse than before. The wound in his side had soaked through his shirt. "We've identified the main conspirators. Lord Caius, obviously. Duke Farron from the eastern provinces. General Kelson. At least 15 noble houses have openly declared for the rebellion." 15. Kaelen felt the number like a punch. Out of 40 major houses, 15 had betrayed him. That wasn't a rebellion, that was half the empire. "And Lady Vale?" Kaelen asked, hating himself for needing to know. "What's her role in this?" Malrek hesitated. "According to our intelligence, she was the catalyst. She spent months building relationships with discontented nobles, pointing out flaws in your governance, providing evidence of corruption. She didn't organize the rebellion directly, but she created the conditions for it, so this is her fault." Malrek's expression was unreadable. With respect, Your Majesty, she exposed problems that already existed. The question is whether you want to blame the person who revealed the rot or the rot itself. The words landed harder than Kaelen expected, because Malrek was right. Seraphine hadn't invented the discontent. She'd just given it voice, given people permission to question whether fear was really the same thing as respect, whether survival was worth the cost of humanity. Kaelen looked at the map spread before him, at the shrinking territory marked in royal blue, at the expanding red zones showing rebel control, at the empire he'd built becoming the empire he'd destroyed. "I need to speak with her," he said quietly. "Your Majesty, that's not advisable," Voss protested. "She's a confirmed enemy operative. Any conversation is a security risk. Then post guards and listen at the door." Kaelen stood. "I don't care. I need answers only she can provide." Theron caught his arm. "And if those answers are just more manipulation, then at least I'll know." Kaelen pulled free. "At least I'll understand what I'm actually fighting against." He climbed the tower stairs alone, leaving his council arguing below. Each step felt heavier than the last. By the time he reached the upper chamber, his heart was pounding from more than physical exertion. The guards outside the door saluted. They'd heard him coming. Kaelen paused with his hand on the door handle. What was he doing? His empire was collapsing. Armies were marching on the capital. Half his nobility was in open rebellion. Every second spent here was a second he should be planning military responses, or securing supply lines, or executing the strategic brilliance that had won him a crown in the first place. But he opened the door anyway. The chamber was small, stone walls, single window overlooking the burning city. A bed, a chair, nothing else. Seraphine sat on the floor against the far wall, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them. She looked smaller than he'd ever seen her, more human, more breakable. She didn't look up when he entered. Kaelen closed the door behind him, locked it. Not to keep her in, but to keep everyone else out. "They say you orchestrated this entire thing," he said into the silence. "They're partially right." Her voice was hollow. "I connected people, showed them they weren't alone in their doubts, gave them language for their frustrations. So you admit it." "I admit I told the truth about what I saw, about executions that served no purpose except intimidation, about policies that starved provinces to feed your war machine, about a king so terrified of appearing weak that he became the very monster he claimed to fight against." Kaelen felt anger flare hot in his chest. "You don't know what it takes to hold an empire together." "No." Seraphine finally looked at him, and her eyes were red-rimmed. "I know what it cost. I saw it every time you stood in that tower watching people burn and felt nothing. Every time you made a decision that sacrificed someone else's humanity for your survival. Because survival is all that matters." Kaelen's voice rose. "You think I wanted to become this? You think I enjoyed building an empire on fear? I think you convinced yourself it was necessary." She stood, facing him across the small room. "I think you inherited your father's sins and decided the only way to survive them was to become worse, harsher, more ruthless, until you couldn't tell the difference between strength and cruelty anymore." The accusation hit every exposed nerve. Because she was right. Kaelen had spent 10 years telling himself that mercy was weakness, that love was vulnerability, that being feared was safer than being respected. And now his empire was burning because he'd built it on a foundation of terror that eventually turned inward. "Why?" he asked, and his voice cracked slightly. "If you understood me so well, if you saw what I was trying to do, why work to destroy it?" Seraphine moved closer. Her hand came up like she might touch him, then fell. "Because understanding doesn't mean agreeing. Because I watched you execute people who could have been redeemed. Because every time you chose fear over compassion, you became a little more like the father you claimed to hate. I am nothing like him. You're exactly like him." Tears finally fell down her face. "The only difference is you know it. You carry the weight of every decision. You hate yourself for the cruelty even as you justify it. Your father never felt guilty. You feel guilty about everything. And somehow that makes it worse because you do it anyway." The words stripped away every defense Kaelen had constructed, left him standing there in a locked tower room with a woman who'd betrayed him, and somehow still saw him more clearly than anyone else ever had. "I don't know how to be anything else," he admitted quietly. Fear is the only language I know. Then learn a different one. Seraphine's voice softened. Before it's too late. It's already too late. Kaelen gestured toward the window where smoke rose from the burning palace. Half the empire is in rebellion. Norvain is invading. My own generals are defecting. This is what happens when you show weakness. No. She stepped even closer, close enough that he could smell jasmine through the smoke. This is what happens when you confuse strength with dominance, when you treat every relationship as a power struggle instead of a connection. Connection gets you killed. Isolation gets you this. Seraphine gestured at the burning city. A king so alone that when he finally falls, no one tries to catch him. The truth of it took Kaelen's breath away, because she was absolutely right. He'd built an empire of fear, and when it collapsed, no one loyal enough to save it remained. Just allies of convenience waiting to see which way the wind blew. And standing here in front of the woman who'd helped orchestrate his downfall, Kaelen realized something devastating. She was the only person in the entire empire who'd ever been honest with him, who'd challenged him instead of obeying, who'd looked at the great Alpha King and seen a man trapped inside his own legend. I should execute you, he said without conviction. I know, I should make an example, show the rebels that betrayal has consequences. You should. But he didn't move, didn't reach for his sword or call the guards or do any of the things a rational king would do. Just stood there while his empire burned and his heart fought against 10 years of carefully constructed walls. The door burst open. Captain Draven stood there, eyes wide. Your Majesty, Lord Theron says you need to see this immediately. Kaelen didn't take his eyes off Seraphine. See what? Just come. Now. The urgency in Draven's voice pulled Kaelen back to reality. He turned toward the door, then paused, looked back at Seraphine standing in the middle of the small room. This isn't over, he said. I know. When we survive this, if we survive this. When we survive this, Kaelen repeated firmly, you and I are finishing this conversation. Then he left, locking the door behind him and following Draven down the tower stairs. The lower chamber had transformed into chaos. Theron stood over the maps, but they'd been marked with new intelligence. Red zones had expanded dramatically. Blue zones had shrunk to almost nothing. And there, marked in black at the northern border, was something that made Kaelen's blood freeze. Norvain's entire army. Not the advance force they'd reported earlier, the full might of a nation. 50,000 soldiers, marching on the capital. How long? Kaelen asked. Theron didn't look up. 12 hours. Maybe less, if they force-marched through the night. 12 hours until the largest military force on the continent reached a capital already torn apart by internal rebellion. 12 hours until Varelion ceased to exist. Your Majesty, Malric said quietly, there's more. Of course there is. We intercepted communications between Caius and the Norvain High Command. The invasion wasn't opportunistic. It was coordinated, planned months in advance. So the rebellion and the invasion are linked. More than that. Malric's face was grim. Lord Caius has promised Norvain the throne in exchange for military support. If he wins, Varelion becomes a client state. We don't just lose the empire, we lose our sovereignty entirely. The room went silent. Kaelen looked at the faces around him. Theron, loyal to the end but clearly exhausted. Voss, competent but already calculating odds. Malric, bleeding from a wound he refused to treat. Draven and the scattered soldiers who'd stayed faithful despite having every reason to defect. These were the people who believed in him, or at least believed in the Empire enough to keep fighting. And Kaelen was about to lead them into a battle they couldn't possibly win. Gentlemen, he said slowly, I need your honest assessment. Can we defend the capital against both the rebellion and Norvain's army? No one answered. That was answer enough. Then we have three options. Kaelen began pacing, his tactical mind working through impossible mathematics. We fortify the northern tower and fight until we're overwhelmed. We surrender to Caius and hope for mercy. Or we abandon the capital entirely and regroup with whatever loyal forces remain in the provinces. Theron grunted. The first option is suicide. The second is cowardice. The third means abandoning everyone who can evacuate. So suicide, cowardice, or abandonment. Kaelen laughed bitterly. Wonderful options. Your Majesty, Voss said carefully, there might be a fourth option. Everyone turned. The general hesitated before continuing. What if you give them what they want? Explain. They're rebelling because they fear you, because they believe you're a tyrant who'll never change. What if you prove them wrong? Publicly abdicate. Transfer power to a council. Surrender the throne before Norvan reaches the capital. Kaelen stared at him. You're suggesting I give up. I'm suggesting you remove the reason for the rebellion. Without you on the throne, Caius loses his legitimacy. The rebel nobles have no cause. And Norvain's invasion becomes an act of foreign aggression instead of a liberation. The logic was sound. Terrifying, but sound. If Kaelen stepped down, the entire power structure shifted. The rebellion became unnecessary. The noble houses would have to negotiate with each other instead of uniting against a common enemy. It might actually work, but it meant surrendering everything he'd built, every sacrifice, every calculated cruelty, every decision made in the name of survival. Gone. And what happens to me? Kaelen asked quietly. Voss met his eyes. Exile, probably. Maybe imprisonment. Depends on how generous the new council feels. So I save the Empire by destroying myself. You save the Empire by proving you actually care about it more than your own power. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Kaelen turned away, moving to the window overlooking the burning city. From here, he could see the full extent of the damage. Entire districts consumed by fire. The palace reduced to a contested war zone, smoke rising like funeral pyres for an empire eating itself alive. This was his legacy, not the conquests or the United Kingdoms or the decade of forced peace. This, destruction and betrayal and the smoking ruins of everything he'd tried to build. Your Majesty, Theron said gently, you need to decide soon. Every minute we wait, more people die. Kaelen closed his eyes, thought about his father dying in the throne room, too proud to retreat, thought about Seraphine locked in the tower above, seeing him more clearly than he'd ever seen himself, thought about the choice between being a king and being human, and for the first time in 10 years, Kaelen chose the latter. I'll do it, he said, turning back to face his council. I'll abdicate, but on my terms. What terms? Malrek asked. Kaelen's mind raced, building strategy from desperation. We send word to Caius and the rebel houses immediately. Offer full abdication in exchange for 3 conditions. First, no reprisals against soldiers who remained loyal. Second, Norvain's forces turn back or face united resistance from all Varelion houses. Third, Seraphine Vale goes free. The last condition made everyone go still. Your Majesty, Voss said carefully, Lady Vale orchestrated this entire... I know what she did. Kaelen's voice was firm. And she did it because I gave her every reason to. Because I built an empire so focused on control that I forgot what I was supposed to be controlling it for. She goes free. That's non-negotiable. Theron studied him. You care about her. It wasn't a question. Kaelen didn't deny it. Draft the terms, he ordered. Send them to Caius under flag of truce, and prepare to evacuate the northern tower. If they accept, we'll need to move quickly before Norvain arrives. And if they don't accept, Riven asked. Then we die fighting, Kaelen said simply. But at least we'll die knowing we tried something other than more violence. As his council dispersed to execute the orders, Kaelen stood alone in the chamber. He'd just agreed to give up everything. The throne, the crown, the empire he'd spent half his life building, all for a chance at proving he was capable of being more than the monster everyone believed him to be. For a chance at redemption he probably didn't deserve. For a woman who'd betrayed him and somehow still represented the only honest thing in his entire life. Kaelen climbed the tower stairs one more time, unlocked the door. Seraphine stood at the window, silhouetted against the burning city. She turned when he entered, and something in her expression shifted when she saw his face. What happened? I'm abdicating, Kaelen said, surrendering the throne, ending the empire as we know it. Her eyes went wide. Why? Because you were right, about all of it. Kaelen moved closer. I built something that could only survive through fear, and fear is a foundation that eventually collapses. Better to tear it down myself than watch it crush everyone beneath it. Seraphine's breath caught. Kaelen, I included you in the terms, he continued. You go free. No charges, no consequences. You can leave Varelion entirely if you want. And you? Exile. Maybe imprisonment. Depends on how much they hate me. She turned away, hands gripping the windowsill. You're destroying yourself to save people who want you dead. I'm destroying the crown to save the man underneath it. Kaelen stopped just behind her. There's a difference. For a long moment, neither spoke. Below them, the city continued burning. In the distance, Kaelen could hear the sounds of fighting slowly diminishing as word of the abdication spread. It might actually work. The Empire might actually survive him stepping down. I'm sorry, Seraphine whispered, for what I did, for using you, for thinking that revenge would somehow make my family's deaths matter. Kaelen wanted to say it was fine, that he understood, that betrayal was just another form of honesty. But the words stuck in his throat, because it wasn't fine. It hurt in ways he hadn't let anything hurt for years. But he also understood why she'd done it, and understanding, he was learning, was its own kind of forgiveness. The door burst open again. Malrek stood there, face pale. Your Majesty, we have a problem. Of course we do. What now? Caius rejected the terms. The advisor's voice shook. He says abdication isn't enough. He wants you executed, publicly, as proof that the old regime is truly dead. The words settled like stones. Kaelen felt something cold and final click into place. Because of course Caius wanted blood. Revolutions always did. You couldn't build a new empire without completely destroying the old one first, and Kaelen represented everything that needed destroying. Fine, he said quietly. Your Majesty? Malrek started. Fine, Kaelen repeated louder. I'll do it. The room went silent. Seraphine spun around. You can't be serious. I'm very serious. Kaelen met her eyes. If my death ends this, if it stops the fighting and gives the Empire a chance to rebuild without me as the wound that won't heal, then it's worth it. That's not redemption, she said fiercely. That's just suicide with better branding. Maybe. Kaelen smiled sadly. But it's the only move I have left. He turned to Malrek. Tell Caius I accept his terms. Public execution. Tomorrow at dawn. In exchange, the rebellion ends immediately and Norvain's forces withdraw. The advisor looked stricken. Your Majesty, please reconsider. We can still fight. We can die pointlessly, taking thousands with us. Kaelen's voice was firm. Or I can die purposefully and maybe save something worth saving. Draft the response. After Malrek left, Seraphine grabbed Kaelen's arm. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do. He covered her hand with his. Because this is the first decision I've made in 10 years that isn't about survival or power or control. It's just about being human enough to recognize when to stop fighting. Her fingers tightened on his arm. What if I don't want you to stop? The question hung between them. Kaelen looked at this woman who'd destroyed his empire and somehow saved his soul, who'd seen through every defense and still stood here arguing for his life. Then help me make these last hours mean something, he said quietly. How? Tell me the truth. All of it. Was any of it real? Seraphine's eyes filled with tears, and in that small tower room, while his empire collapsed and dawn approached with the promise of execution, she finally answered the question that mattered most. Yes, the single word hung in the smoke-filled air between them, like a confession and a condemnation all at once. Seraphine's tears fell freely now, carving clean tracks through the dust and ash coating her face. Her hand still gripped Kaelen's arm, fingers tight enough to leave marks. Yes, she repeated, voice breaking. It was real, all of it. The conversations, the debates, the moments on balconies when I forgot I was supposed to hate you. It became real and I hated myself for it because feeling something for you felt like betraying my family all over again. Kaelen stood frozen, processing the admission. Processing the weight of knowing that the one genuine connection he'd allowed himself in a decade had been built on lies that somehow transformed into truth. How do I believe you? He asked quietly. How do I know this isn't just another manipulation? You don't. Seraphine's laugh was bitter and broken. That's the price of betrayal. Even when I'm finally being honest, you'll never know for certain. And I have to live with that, with destroying the only thing that ever made me feel human again. The irony wasn't lost on Kaelen. They'd both spent years becoming monsters to survive, She'd plotted revenge. He'd ruled through fear. And somewhere in the collision of their carefully constructed armor, they'd accidentally found something neither expected. Connection. Understanding. The dangerous possibility that maybe they could be more than their worst decisions. And now he was going to die at dawn, making that possibility irrelevant. "I need to know something," Kaelen said. "When you were feeding intelligence to the rebels, when you were building the coalition against me, did you know it would lead to this? To invasion and public execution?" "No." The answer came fast, genuine. "I thought exposing your cruelty would force reform. That public pressure would make you change. I didn't realize how deep the hatred ran. How many people were waiting for any excuse to tear down what you'd built. So you wanted to fix me, not destroy me. I wanted you to stop being what you'd become and remember what you could be." The distinction mattered more than Kaelen could articulate, because it meant she'd seen something in him worth saving. Even while orchestrating his downfall, she'd believed in the possibility of redemption. That belief might be the most valuable thing anyone had ever given him. Footsteps on the stairs interrupted the moment. Captain Draven appeared in the doorway, looking grim. "Your Majesty," Caius has responded. "He accepts your terms. Execution at dawn in the central plaza. In exchange, all hostilities cease immediately, and Norvan's forces will withdraw once confirmation is provided." So it's done. Kaelen felt strange calm settle over him. "How long until dawn?" 4 hours, my lord. 4 hours left to exist. 4 hours to make peace with a life spent chasing power that ultimately meant nothing. Kaelen turned to Seraphine. "You're free to go. The terms included your release. I'm not going anywhere." Her jaw set with familiar stubborn determination. "If you're dying because of what I started, I'm staying until the end. That's not necessary. It absolutely is." Seraphine moved closer, close enough that he could see the storm colors in her eyes shifting with emotion. "You don't get to make a noble sacrifice while I hide like a coward. I own my role in this." Before Kaelen could argue, Malrek appeared behind Draven, breathing hard. "Your Majesty, we have a situation." "Of course we do." Kaelen felt exhaustion settling into his bones. "What now?" "Lord Theron requests your presence in the lower chamber. Immediately. He says it's urgent. Everything is urgent when you have 4 hours to live." But Kaelen followed anyway, Seraphine close behind despite Draven's weak protests about security protocols. The lower chamber had filled with more people since Kaelen had last been there. Soldiers, advisors, a few nobles who'd remained loyal. They all stood around the central table where maps had been replaced by documents. Documents covered in blood. Theron looked up as Kaelen entered, and something in the old commander's expression made ice form in Kaelen's chest. "Your Majesty, we intercepted a courier heading toward Norvain's encampment. He was carrying these." Theron gestured at the blood-stained papers. "You need to read them." Kaelen picked up the first document. It was a military report detailing troop movements within the palace, defensive positions, guard rotations, structural weaknesses, intelligence that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of royal security. He picked up another. Financial records showing payments made to rebel leaders over the past 6 months. Large sums transferred through intermediaries. The next document was a letter written in familiar handwriting. Kaelen's blood went cold as he read it. The letter was addressed to Lord Caius. It outlined a complete strategy for destabilizing the throne. Specific nobles to target, arguments to use, weaknesses to exploit, a detailed plan for coordinating internal rebellion with external invasion. And it was signed by Lord Malrek. Kaelen looked up slowly. Malrek stood near the doorway, still clutching his wounded side. His face had gone pale. The entire chamber went silent. "Your Majesty," Theron said carefully, "there's more. The wound Lord Malrek claims to have received during the initial attack isn't real," Kaelen finished, understanding flooding through him. "It's theater. Blood from a vial or a shallow self-inflicted cut." Malrek's hand dropped from his side, and just like that, the final piece clicked into place. The coordinated attacks, the perfect timing, the intelligence that let rebels know exactly where to strike. The advisor who'd been at Kaelen's side for a decade, trusted with every secret, privy to every strategy. The betrayal hadn't come from outside the inner circle. It had been living inside it all along. "How long?" Kaelen's voice came out deadly quiet. "How long have you been working against me?" Malrek straightened, abandoning pretense. Since the beginning, since your father first crowned you king at 19 and I realized you were going to be exactly like him, you helped me build this empire. I helped you build a prison. Malrek's cultured veneer cracked, showing something sharp and bitter underneath. Do you know what it's like watching you repeat every mistake your father made, seeing you become the same tyrant while believing you were somehow different? I am different. You execute people before breakfast. You rule through fear. You've spent a decade proving that compassion is weakness and loyalty is measured by obedience. Malrek laughed bitterly. You're not different. You're just more self-aware. You know you're a monster and you do it anyway. The words cut because they echoed Seraphine's assessment, because they contained truth Kaelen had been avoiding for years. So what was your plan? He demanded. Engineer my downfall from within while playing the loyal advisor? Exactly that. Malrek moved away from the door, no longer bothering with submission. I spent years building relationships with discontented nobles, feeding them information, showing them patterns. When Lady Vale arrived with her own agenda, I simply provided the tools to make her revenge effective. Seraphine stepped forward. You used me. We used each other, my dear. Malrek's smile was cold. You wanted to expose the king's cruelty. I wanted to create conditions for revolution. Our goals aligned beautifully. Kaelen felt fury rising through the numbness. You sent those documents to Caius. You told him to demand my execution instead of accepting abdication. Of course. Malrek spread his hands. Abdication leaves you alive. Alive means you're a symbol, a potential rallying point for loyalists. The only way to truly end the old regime is to end you permanently. The chamber erupted into chaos. Soldiers moved to seize Malrek. Theron reached for his sword. Captain Draven shouted orders. But Malrek just stood there, smiling. You can kill me, he said calmly. But it won't change anything. The execution is already arranged. Caius has his instructions. Norvain has its timeline. Even if you eliminate me, the machinery is already in motion. Then we stop it, General Voss growled. We fortify positions. We fight. With 80 soldiers against thousands? Malrek laughed. Please, you lost this war before you knew you were fighting it. Kaelen stared at this man he'd trusted for a decade. This man who'd advised him through battles, who'd been present for every major decision, who'd helped shape the empire Kaelen thought he was building, all while actively working to destroy it. The ultimate betrayal wasn't that Malrek had been an enemy. It was that he'd been a mirror, showing Kaelen exactly what he'd become by reflecting it back with calculated precision. Why tell me all this? Kaelen asked. Why not maintain the act until dawn? Because I want you to understand something before you die. Malrek's expression turned serious. I didn't betray you because I hated you personally. I betrayed you because you represent everything wrong with how power works. The belief that fear and control can substitute for actual leadership. The idea that being strong means being cruel. And what's your alternative? Malrek gestured at nothing, something better, something that doesn't require a king willing to watch his own people burn. Before Kaelen could respond, the door burst open. A young soldier stumbled in, eyes wild. My lord, Norvain's army, they're not withdrawing. What? Theron moved to the window. They're accelerating, force marching toward the capital. They'll be here in hours, not days. The room went still. I don't understand, Captain Draven said. The agreement was... There is no agreement. All eyes turned to Malrek, who looked almost sympathetic. Did you really think Norvain would honor terms negotiated by a dying regime? They want the capital. They want the empire. Caius promised them both in exchange for military support. So the execution was always a distraction, Seraphine said quietly. Keep us focused on Kaelen's death while Norvain marches unopposed. Malrek smiled. You're very clever, Lady Vale. It's unfortunate we ended up on opposite sides. The full scope of the betrayal settled over the room like ash. Malrek hadn't just engineered a coup. He'd arranged a complete transfer of power to a foreign nation. Varelion wouldn't just change rulers. It would cease to exist entirely, absorbed into Norvain's expanding territory. And he'd done it by manipulating everyone. The rebels who thought they were fighting for reform. Seraphine who thought she was exposing tyranny. Even Kaelen who thought he was making a noble sacrifice. All pawns in a larger game they hadn't understood until it was too late. Here's what nobody teaches you about betrayal. It's not the act itself that destroys you. It's the moment you realize how completely you were played, how every decision you made was anticipated and accounted for, how your attempt at redemption was just another move on a board you didn't know existed. Kaelen looked at the maps showing Norvain's advance, at the 80 exhausted soldiers who'd stayed loyal, at Seraphine standing beside him wearing guilt-like armor, at Malrek who'd orchestrated everything while pretending to serve, at the complete and total destruction of everything he'd spent 10 years building, and something inside him broke. Not snapped. Broke. Shattered into pieces that couldn't be reassembled into the shape they'd been before. The Alpha King who ruled through fear and calculated cruelty. The strategist who always had a plan. The man convinced that survival meant staying one step ahead of betrayal. That person died in the northern tower surrounded by the evidence of his complete failure. What emerged from the wreckage was something different. Something that had been buried for so long Kaelen had forgotten it existed. The human being underneath the crown. "Arrest him," Kaelen said quietly, gesturing at Malrek. "Secure him in the lower cells. We'll deal with treason charges later." "Your Majesty," Theron protested. "We should execute him immediately. We should be better than what we've been," Kaelen interrupted. "Which means no more summary executions, no more ruling through fear, no more becoming the monsters we're trying to defeat." The words felt foreign in his mouth, like speaking a language he'd once known but had forgotten how to pronounce. Malrek laughed as soldiers moved to bind him. "You think mercy makes you noble? It just makes you weak. That's why you're going to lose." "Maybe," Kaelen agreed, "but I'd rather lose being human than win being what you think I am." After they dragged Malrek away, Kaelen turned to his remaining council. The situation was catastrophic. Norvain would reach the capital by dawn. The rebel houses still controlled most of the palace. His own forces numbered less than 100 soldiers. There was no realistic path to military victory. But Kaelen wasn't thinking about military victory anymore. He was thinking about something Seraphine had said weeks ago during a council debate, about how terror required constant escalation, about how fear was expensive and loyalty couldn't be bought, about how strength without compassion was just tyranny waiting to collapse. "Send word to every remaining loyal commander," Kaelen ordered. "Every garrison, every unit still under royal control. Tell them to stand down." "Your Majesty," General Voss looked stricken. "That's suicide. Without military resistance, Norvain walks into a city that's not fighting back," Kaelen finished. "Do you know what happens to invading armies when there's no battle to fight? When the population isn't an enemy but a hostage?" "They're forced to occupy instead of conquer," Seraphine said quietly. Understanding was dawning in her eyes. "You're removing the justification for violence." "Exactly." Kaelen moved to the maps, seeing them with new clarity. Norvain needs this to look like liberation, needs the population to welcome them as saviors from tyranny. But if I'm not fighting, if there's no tyrant to defeat, what are they liberating anyone from? "Lord Caius and the rebels," Theron said slowly. "They become the violent ones, the ones attacking a king who surrendered, and Norvain becomes their accomplice instead of their ally." The strategy was insane, reckless, completely contrary to every tactical principle Kaelen had ever learned. It was also the only move he had left. "But there's more," Kaelen continued. "We're not just standing down. We're opening the gates. Every citizen who wants to leave the capital gets safe passage. Every rebel house that wants to surrender gets amnesty. Every soldier who wants to defect faces no consequences." "You're giving away the Empire," Voss protested. "I'm admitting I already lost it." Kaelen's voice was firm. "The question now is whether I lose it with more bloodshed or whether I lose it in a way that might actually save lives." "And what about Caius?" Theron demanded. "What about his demands for your execution?" Kaelen smiled grimly. "Caius demanded my execution as proof the old regime was dead. So we prove it differently. I'm abdicating publicly, right now, before dawn, before Norvain arrives, before anyone can claim this is a forced surrender. That's politically meaningless if you're dead an hour later. Then I won't be." Kaelen turned to face his council fully. "I'm not showing up for the execution. I'm leaving the capital entirely. Let them search for a king who no longer exists." The room erupted into arguments. Half thought it was brilliant. Half thought it was cowardice. All of them understood it was a gamble that would either save the empire or doom it completely. But Kaelen wasn't looking at them anymore. He was looking at Seraphine. She stood apart from the arguing council, arms crossed, expression unreadable. But her eyes held something that might have been hope. "I need you to do something," Kaelen said quietly, moving to stand beside her. "Something only you can do." "What?" "Go to the rebel houses. To Caius. To everyone who wanted me gone. Tell them they won. Tell them the tyrant king recognized his failures and chose exile over more bloodshed. Tell them the empire is theirs to rebuild." Her eyes widened. "You want me to deliver your abdication? I want you to deliver the proof that people can change, that even monsters can choose to stop being monstrous." Kaelen held her gaze. "You're the only person who can make them believe it, because you're the only person who saw both versions of me and can testify that the transformation is real. What if they don't believe me? Then we die anyway, and at least I spent my last hours trying to be better than I was." Seraphine's breath caught. "This is insane. Completely. But insanity is all I have left." She studied his face like she was memorizing it, searching for any hint of the Alpha King who'd ruled through fear, finding instead a man who'd finally remembered what it meant to choose compassion over control. "I'll do it," she said finally, "but not because I think it'll work. Because you deserve the chance to try." Before Kaelen could respond, she stepped close and kissed him. Brief, fierce, tasting of smoke and tears and all the complicated truth between them. Then she pulled away and headed for the door, calling over her shoulder that she needed an escort and flags of truce. Leaving Kaelen standing in the council chamber with the weight of an impossible decision and the ghost of her touch still burning on his lips. Theron moved beside him. "Are you certain about this?" "No." Kaelen watched her disappear down the stairs. "But I'm certain that doing what I've always done will lead to exactly what always happens. More death, more fear, more empire built on graves. And if this fails, then I'll die knowing I tried to be something other than what I was." The old commander nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, Your Majesty, I think this is the first truly brave decision you've made in years." The words landed with unexpected weight. Because Theron was right. Leading armies into battle was easy. Executing enemies was simple. Ruling through fear required no courage at all. But admitting you were wrong, surrendering power, choosing vulnerability over strength, that took a kind of bravery Kaelen had never needed before. The next hours passed in controlled chaos. Messengers ran through the tower carrying Kaelen's orders. "Stand down, open gates, offer amnesty." Every command was the opposite of what an Alpha King should do. Every command felt like stripping away armor he'd worn for so long it had fused with his skin. Captain Draven reported that citizens were already flooding out of the capital, thousands fleeing before Norvain arrived. The exodus was orderly, peaceful, nothing like the panic Kaelen had expected. General Voss confirmed that most military units were complying with the stand-down order. Some commanders were confused. A few were openly angry. But they were obeying. Because even in abdication, Kaelen still commanded enough respect that his orders carried weight. That realization was both humbling and heartbreaking. Theron appeared near midnight with news from Seraphine. She'd reached Lord Caius, delivered the terms. The rebel leader was refusing to meet with her. "So it's not working," Kaelen said flatly. "I didn't say that." Theron's expression was complicated. "Caius won't meet with her, but several other rebel houses are listening. Duke Farron has already withdrawn his forces from the palace grounds. 2 other noble families have declared for a transitional council. The rebellion is fracturing." "It's confused," Theron corrected. "They united against you. Now that you've removed yourself, they have to decide what they actually stand for. And Norvain? Still advancing, but slower, like they're waiting to see what happens. Because Norvain's strategy depended on invading a country torn apart by civil war. Depended on looking like liberators instead of conquerors. But if Varelion wasn't fighting itself, if the old king had voluntarily stepped down, if the transition was happening peacefully, then Norvain became the aggressors, became the violent ones threatening a nation trying to reform itself. The political calculus shifted entirely. It might actually work, Kaelen breathed. This insane plan might actually save the Empire. Perhaps. Theron's tone carried warning. But it won't save you. I know. Kaya still wants your head. The rebel houses might fracture, But the ones who lost family to your executions won't forget. You'll spend the rest of your life running, better running as a human than ruling as a monster." The old commander smiled sadly. "When did you become wise?" "When I finally admitted I'd been foolish." They stood together in the tower window, watching the last citizens evacuate the capital below. Fires still burned in some districts, but the fighting had stopped. The palace grounds were eerily quiet. It looked like a city holding its breath, waiting to see if peace was possible or if dawn would bring more violence. Near 3 in the morning, Seraphine returned. She looked exhausted, covered in dust and ash, but her eyes were bright with something that might have been hope. "I met with 8 noble houses," she reported, accepting water from Captain Draven. 5 are willing to support a transitional council. 2 are undecided. 1 still backs Caius unconditionally. "And Caius himself?" Kaelen asked. Seraphine hesitated. "He's isolated. His closest allies are abandoning him. The rebellion is collapsing because it was always held together by anger at you, not by shared vision of what comes next. So removing myself removed the glue." She nodded. "But he's desperate now." Desperate people make dangerous decisions. He sent word that dawn still brings execution, that anyone who shelters you is an enemy of the new Varelion. Then I leave before dawn. Kaelen had already made peace with exile. Disappear into the provinces. Hide until this settles. "You can't!" Seraphine's expression turned grim. "Norvain's forces have surrounded the capital. Every road is blocked. They're not letting anyone in or out until the political situation resolves. So I'm trapped. We're all trapped." The reality settled over the room like a burial shroud. Kaelen had successfully fractured the rebellion, had removed himself as the focal point of hatred, had given the Empire a chance at peaceful transition, but he'd done it too late to save himself. Norvain would arrive at dawn. Caius would demand execution, and Kaelen had nowhere to run. The human being who'd emerged from the wreckage of the Alpha King was about to die anyway. Maybe that was justice. Maybe you couldn't build an empire on fear and cruelty without eventually paying the price. Maybe redemption wasn't about escaping consequences, but about facing them with dignity. Kaelen looked at Seraphine standing in the tower room, exhausted and determined, and somehow still fighting for him despite every reason to let him fall. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for everything you witnessed, for the king I was, for pulling you into this disaster. Don't apologize for changing." She moved closer. "Most people spend their whole lives refusing to admit they're wrong. You admitted it when it mattered most. Bit late, though. Better late than never." They stood close enough to touch, but didn't. Just existed in the same space while the Empire crumbled around them. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, dawn approaching with the weight of prophecy. "Your Majesty," Theron called from the lower chamber, "Norvain's scouts are visible from the eastern watchtower. They'll be at the gates within the hour." This was it. The final moments before everything ended. Kaelen took a breath, steadying himself. "Then we face them. Not as conquerors, not as warriors, as people willing to admit defeat without shame." "That's not very alpha of you," Seraphine said softly. "Good." Kaelen smiled. "I'm done being alpha. I'm just trying to be human." They descended the tower together, Kaelen and Seraphine and the handful of soldiers who'd stayed loyal to the end, walked through the palace grounds where fighting had raged hours earlier, past the throne room where Kaelen had ruled for a decade. The Iron Throne sat empty, abandoned, covered in dust and dried blood. Kaelen didn't even glance at it, just kept walking toward the main gates where Norvain's army waited and his fate would be decided by forces beyond his control. For the first time in 10 years, he wasn't trying to manipulate the outcome, wasn't calculating 3 moves ahead, wasn't preparing contingencies or backup plans or strategic retreats. He was just a man walking toward whatever came next with his eyes open and his armor finally stripped away. The gates stood open. Beyond them, Norvain's forces stretched across the horizon like a dark tide. 50,000 soldiers arranged in perfect formation, cavalry on the flanks, siege equipment at the rear, command banners flying in the pre-dawn wind, and at the front, mounted on a black warhorse, sat the Norvain High Commander. Beside him, wearing captured Varelion colors, sat Lord Caius, the 2 architects of Kaelen's destruction, united in victory. Kaelen walked through the gates unarmed. Seraphine insisted on coming. Theron and a dozen soldiers followed as escort. They stopped 20 paces from the Norvan lines. The High Commander dismounted. He was older than Kaelen expected, silver-haired and scarred, with the look of someone who'd seen too many wars. "King Kaelen Draven," the commander's voice carried across the field. "I am High Commander Ravon of Norvain. You are hereby ordered to surrender yourself for execution, as agreed with Lord Caius Heron and the Provisional Government of Varelion." "I've already surrendered," Kaelen called back. "Abdicated the throne, ordered all forces to stand down. The Empire is yours without need for more bloodshed." "The Empire was always going to be ours." Caius's voice was sharp with triumph. "Your abdication changes nothing. The people demand justice for your crimes." "Justice or revenge?" Kaelen asked. "Because one rebuilds nations, the other just creates more corpses. That's not your decision to make anymore." "You're right," Kaelen spread his hands. "I'm no longer king, no longer commander, just a man accepting consequences for his failures. So take me. Execute me if that's what brings peace. But let everyone else go. Let Varelion rebuild without more violence." Ravon studied him for a long moment. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "A tyrant fighting to the last breath. Instead, I find a defeated man trying to bargain for his people. Maybe I'm finally learning what leadership actually means." The High Commander glanced at Caius, then back at Kaelen. "There's been a development you should know about." "What development?" "Your former advisor, Lord Malrek, was captured by my scouts several hours ago. He was trying to reach our lines carrying documents he claimed would interest me." Kaelen felt ice form in his chest. "What documents?" "Proof that this entire operation was orchestrated by him, that he manipulated both the rebellion and Norvan's involvement, that neither I nor Lord Caius were actually in control of our own strategy." Ravon's expression was dangerously neutral. "When I signed treaties with Caius, I believed I was supporting legitimate regime change. Instead, I discover I was a pawn in a scheme designed to transfer Varelion's sovereignty to Norvain without my knowledge or consent." "So what happens now?" Kaelen asked carefully. "Now I have to decide whether to proceed with an invasion I never actually authorized, or to withdraw based on the revelation that my entire justification was manufactured." Caius shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable with where this was going. "But there's a complication," Ravon continued. "Malrek claims he can prove Kaelen Draven knew about the plot, that the king's abdication was theater designed to make Norvain look like aggressors, that everything, including this conversation, is calculated manipulation. Is that true?" Seraphine's voice cut through the tension. Every eye turned to her. "Did you know Malrek was orchestrating all of this? Did you plan your abdication knowing it would make Norvan vulnerable?" Kaelen met her gaze, saw the question behind the question, saw her asking whether any of his transformation was real or if it had all been strategy. "No," he said simply. "I had no idea about Malrek's larger plans until hours ago. My abdication wasn't theater, it was desperation. The last act of a king who finally realized he'd become the problem." "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Ravon demanded. "You don't." Kaelen looked at the High Commander directly. "Just like I didn't know who to trust in my own council. Just like Caius didn't know Malrek was using him. We're all operating with incomplete information and making choices based on who we decide to believe. That's not an answer." "It's the only honest answer I have." Kaelen's voice carried across the field with quiet intensity. "I was a terrible king, cruel when I should have been merciful, paranoid when I should have been trusting. I built an empire on fear because I was too afraid to build it any other way. And it collapsed because fear is a foundation that can't support anything permanent." He gestured at the assembled armies. "Now you have to decide what kind of empire you want to build. One based on invasion and conquest, or one that respects sovereignty even when conquest would be easy." The challenge hung in the air. Ravon exchanged looks with his officers. Caius sat frozen on his horse, clearly realizing that his carefully orchestrated victory was unraveling. And Kaelen stood unarmed in front of 50,000 soldiers, having said everything he could say, having done everything except survive. The High Commander was about to respond when a shout rang out from the Varelion walls. Kaelen turned to see a rider approaching from the city, flying noble house colors he didn't recognize at first. Then he did. It was Duke Farron's banner, one of the rebel houses that Seraphine had convinced to support peaceful transition. The rider reached them, gasping for breath. High Commander Raven, I bring word from the Provisional Council of Varelion. 15 noble houses have declared for transitional government. They formally request that Norvain respect our sovereignty during this period of internal reform. Raven raised an eyebrow. And if I refuse? Then you will be invading a nation attempting peaceful transition. The writer's voice strengthened. And you will face united resistance from houses that were enemies yesterday but are allies today. Because your presence has given us something we never had before, a common enemy to unite against. The ultimate irony. Kaelen's abdication had fractured the rebellion, but Norvain's invasion was putting it back together under a different banner. Not revenge against a tyrant, survival against foreign conquest. The High Commander looked at Kaelen with something resembling respect. You planned this? No. Kaelen's laugh was genuine. I stumbled into it. But that's the thing about giving up control. Sometimes better outcomes emerge when you stop trying to manipulate every variable. Raven was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to his officers and said something Kaelen didn't expect. Stand down. We're withdrawing. Commander, Caius protested, we had an agreement. We had an agreement based on false pretenses orchestrated by a traitor. Raven's voice cut like a whip. I will not transform Norvain into an invader because some advisor thought he could manipulate us into conquest. My nation has honor, even if yours apparently doesn't. The insult hit Caius visibly, but before he could respond, Raven turned back to Kaelen. You're free to go. Exile yourself. Rebuild your life somewhere your past won't follow, and pray we never meet again under different circumstances. It was mercy Kaelen didn't deserve. Redemption he couldn't earn. Grace offered by an enemy who could have easily destroyed him. Kaelen bowed. A proper bow. Not the slight inclination of a king acknowledging a subject, but the deep respect of one man to another. Thank you. Don't thank me. Raven mounted his horse. Just prove that your transformation was real. Live a life that honors the second chance you've been given. Then he rode away, 50,000 soldiers following in perfect formation, leaving Kaelen standing in front of the Varelion gates with Seraphine beside him and the impossible reality of survival. Caius remained, looking stricken. This isn't over. Yes, it is. Kaelen's voice was tired. Go back to the council. Rebuild the empire. Make it better than what I made it. That's the only revenge that actually matters. You should be dead. Probably, but I'm not. And neither are the thousands of people who would have died in the fighting, so maybe we both won something today. Caius stared at him with undisguised hatred. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward the capital without another word. Theron moved beside Kaelen. What now, your majesty? Don't call me that. Kaelen looked at the city he'd ruled and would never enter again. I'm not a king anymore. Just a man who needs to figure out how to live with what he's done. Where will you go? Somewhere far away. Somewhere I can start over without the weight of the crown following me. He turned to Seraphine. And you? She looked at the city, at the assembled nobles and soldiers waiting to see what happened next, at the empire that was rebuilding itself from the ashes of Kaelen's reign. Then she looked at him. I spent years planning revenge, months orchestrating your downfall, weeks watching you transform from monster to human. She stepped closer. And somewhere in all of that, I forgot to plan what comes after. Kaelen waited, not daring to hope. I could go back to court, she continued, help rebuild, claim a place in the new government, spend my life ensuring the reforms we talked about actually happen. You could. Or I could leave with you, help you figure out how to be human instead of alpha. Watch you stumble through redemption without a crown to hide behind. That's a terrible plan. Kaelen felt his chest tighten, following an exiled tyrant into obscurity. No power, no prestige, nothing except the difficult work of becoming better. I know, Seraphine smiled slightly, but I spent too long watching you fight for transformation to abandon you now that you've actually achieved it. What if I fail? What if without the empire to rule, I become nothing? Then we'll figure out who you are when you're nothing, together. The word hung between them like a promise. Kaelen looked at this woman who'd destroyed his empire and somehow saved his soul, who'd seen him at his worst and chose to stay for whatever came next. And for the first time in 10 years, he chose connection over control, vulnerability over strength, love over fear. He took her hand. And together they turned away from the empire of Varelion, walking toward an uncertain future that held no guarantees except the possibility of becoming more than their worst decisions. Behind them, the city began the difficult work of rebuilding. Ahead of them stretched exile and obscurity, and the terrifying freedom of having nothing left to lose. But Kaelen had learned something crucial in the ruins of his fallen empire. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop fighting. That true strength isn't domination, but the courage to be vulnerable. That redemption isn't earned in a single moment, but in the 1,000 small choices that follow. And that the man who walked away from the throne was worth more than the king who'd sat upon it, even if it took losing everything to finally become him. They made it 7 miles before the pass caught up with them. Kaelen and Seraphine had been walking through the northern forests for hours, following deer trails and old smuggler routes that Theron had sketched on a scrap of parchment before they left. The morning sun filtered through dense canopy, turning the world into patterns of gold and shadow. Behind them, the empire of Varelion was a memory growing smaller with each step. Ahead was nothing but uncertainty and the slim possibility of redemption. Kaelen's legs burned. His shoulders ached from tension he hadn't released since the confrontation with Raven. Every sound made him flinch, every snapped twig or distant bird call sending adrenaline spiking through exhausted veins. This was what it felt like to be prey instead of predator, to be hunted instead of hunter, to walk through the world without the armor of absolute power. Seraphine moved beside him with quiet determination, her court dress torn and muddy from the journey. She hadn't complained once, hadn't questioned the decision to leave everything behind, just walked. They'd been silent for the last hour, each lost in thoughts too complicated for words. Kaelen kept replaying the moment he'd bowed to Raven, kept feeling the weight of the crown he'd finally set down, kept wondering if freedom always felt this much like falling. "We should rest," Seraphine said finally, breaking the silence. "You're going to collapse." "I'm fine. You're limping. Your hands are shaking. You haven't slept in 2 days." She grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. "We're not running from an army anymore. We can afford 10 minutes. Kaelen wanted to argue, wanted to keep moving because movement meant progress, meant distance from everything that had just collapsed. But his body betrayed him. The moment he stopped walking, exhaustion hit like a physical blow. They found a fallen log near a small stream. Kaelen sat heavily, every muscle screaming protest. Seraphine knelt by the water, cupping handfuls to drink before splashing it on her face. For a moment, they could have been anyone. 2 travelers resting on a long journey. Not a fallen king and the woman who'd helped destroy him. Not 2 people carrying the weight of an empire's worth of mistakes. "Do you regret it?" Seraphine asked without looking at him. "Giving up the throne?" Kaelen considered the question, tested the truth of his answer before speaking. "No." The word surprised him with its certainty. "I regret what I did while wearing the crown, but not taking it off, even though it might have saved you, especially because of that." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Dying as a king would have just proven Chaos right. That I was incapable of change, that power was the only thing I cared about. Living as a man gives me the chance to prove otherwise. And if you fail, then I fail trying to be better instead of succeeding at being worse." She smiled slightly, wringing water from her hair. "When did you become philosophical?" "When I ran out of other options. The moment felt peaceful, almost normal. Like they could actually build something resembling a life beyond the ruins of what had been." Then Kaelen heard it. The sound was subtle, barely audible beneath the stream's burbling and wind through leaves. But he'd spent 10 years training his senses to detect threats. Footsteps. Multiple. Moving through the forest with the discipline of military formation. They'd been followed. Seraphine caught his expression. "What is it?" Kaelen held up a hand for silence, listened harder, counted the footfalls, assessed spacing and pace. At least 20 soldiers, moving fast but careful, tracking them through the forest with professional efficiency. "We need to move," he said quietly. "Now." They ran, not the panicked flight of prey, but the controlled retreat of someone who'd escaped death too many times to waste energy on terror. Kaelen led them deeper into the forest, away from the main paths, toward terrain that would slow pursuers. Behind them, the footsteps accelerated, no longer bothering with stealth. They knew their prey had spotted them. The chase was on. Here's what you learn after years of warfare. Running is strategy, not cowardice. Knowing when to retreat saves more lives than stubbornly standing ground. The trick is running toward something instead of just away from everything. Kaelen ran toward higher ground, toward rocky terrain where cavalry couldn't follow and large formations would bottleneck, toward the kind of defensible positions that turned numbers into disadvantage. Old instincts taking over. Alpha King strategy guiding the movements of a man who was no longer king but would always be a survivor. They broke through a dense thicket into a small clearing dominated by ancient stones, ruins of something old, pre-empire, the kind of forgotten places that dotted the landscape like scars from civilizations that hadn't survived. Defensible position, limited approaches, natural barriers. Kaelen's tactical mind cataloged advantages automatically. There, he pointed toward the largest stone formation. We can hold them there if we have to. Hold them with what? Seraphine gasped for breath. We're unarmed, exhausted, against at least 20 soldiers, which is why we negotiate first and fight only if necessary. The soldiers emerged from the tree line moments later. But these weren't Norvain uniforms or rebel house colors. These were Varelion Royal Guard, Kaelen's own soldiers, the ones who'd sworn oaths to protect the throne. And leading them was Captain Draven, the man who'd stood beside Kaelen through the siege, who'd defended the northern tower, who'd stayed loyal when half the guard defected. Kaelen stepped forward, hands visible and empty. Captain, didn't expect to see you again so soon. Draven moved into the clearing, sword drawn but not raised. His face was unreadable. Your Majesty, you need to come back. I'm not Majesty anymore. I abdicated. The throne is Caius's problem now. There is no throne. The captain's voice was strained. Lord Caius is dead, murdered in the palace 3 hours after you left. The words hit like a physical blow. Kaelen felt the world tilt, felt the fragile peace he'd constructed shatter into pieces. How? He demanded. Malrek. Draven's expression was grim. He escaped custody, got to Caius before anyone realized what was happening, slit his throat in front of the Provisional Council and declared himself sovereign regent, claims the empire belongs to whoever's strong enough to hold it. So the betrayal had layers Kaelen hadn't even uncovered yet. Malrek hadn't been working for Caius or Norvan or any specific faction. He'd been working for himself, playing everyone against each other, waiting for the moment when power was loose enough to grab. And Kaelen's abdication had created exactly that opening. The empire is in chaos, Draven continued. Noble houses are fragmenting. Some support Malrek. Some want the old royal line restored. Some are calling for complete dissolution. Without a central authority, we're days from civil war. Then let them figure it out, Kaelen said flatly. I'm done being that authority. You don't understand. Draven stepped closer, voice urgent. Malrek isn't just claiming the throne. He's executing anyone who supported your abdication, calling them traitors who weakened Varelion. Lady Seraphine has been sentenced to death in absentia for sedition. Seraphine went pale beside him. Kaelen felt cold rage building in his chest. How many dead? 17 nobles so far. Another 30 imprisoned awaiting trial. Malrek is using your father's old playbook. Rule through terror. Execute first, justify later. So everything Kaelen had tried to prevent was happening anyway. The violence, the paranoia, the empire devouring itself, because he'd abdicated without ensuring someone competent would take his place. Because he'd chosen personal redemption over practical politics. Because sometimes trying to be good wasn't enough to stop bad things from happening. What do you want from me? Kaelen asked quietly. Come back. Draven's voice carried desperate intensity. Retake the throne. Stop Malrek before the empire tears itself apart. The request was absurd. Impossible. Everything Kaelen had just escaped from, and also the only thing that might actually save the people who'd believed in his transformation. He'd spent hours walking away from power, learning what it felt like to be human instead of king, discovering that freedom meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant living without the armor that had defined him. Now he was being asked to put that armor back on, to become the Alpha King one more time. Not because he wanted power, because people would die without it. Here's the thing about redemption nobody tells you. It's not a destination. It's not something you achieve and then get to keep. It's a series of impossible choices where doing the right thing costs you everything you've sacrificed to become. Kaelen could walk away. could let the empire burn, could protect his own newly discovered humanity and let someone else deal with Malrek's tyranny. That would be the selfish choice, the safe choice, the choice that kept him human. Or he could go back, could retake a throne he'd just surrendered, could put on the crown and become the monster one more time. Not for power, for the people who couldn't defend themselves against someone worse. That would be the selfless choice, the dangerous choice, the choice that might destroy everything he'd just learned about being more than his worst impulses. Kaelen looked at Seraphine, found her watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think you're about to do something incredibly stupid." Her voice was soft. "And I think you know it's the right thing anyway. Going back means becoming what I was. Going back means protecting people from something worse than what you were. There's a difference." "Is there?" Kaelen heard the doubt in his own voice. "Or is that just how every tyrant justifies taking power? Every tyrant wants power for its own sake." Seraphine moved closer. "You just spent hours walking away from it. If you go back now, it won't be for you. It'll be for them. But what if I can't control it? What if putting the crown back on means becoming the Iron Wolf again? What if I... Then I'll be there to remind you who you really are." Her hand found his. "We'll both be there. All of us who saw you change." The offer was terrifying and comforting in equal measure. Kaelen turned back to Draven. How many soldiers stayed loyal to the old regime? Roughly 300, scattered across the capital and surrounding provinces. More would join if you returned. Many are waiting to see if you're actually gone. And Malrek's forces? Unknown. Maybe 1,000. Maybe more. He's been recruiting from the rebel houses, promising them power in the new order. So we'd be outnumbered 3-1. Minimum. At least. Against an enemy holding the palace and the high ground, who has days to fortify positions while we're scrambling to organize. Captain Draven nodded grimly. It's not good odds. Kaelen felt the familiar weight settling over him. The burden of command, of making decisions that would get people killed, of being responsible for outcomes he couldn't control, but would be blamed for anyway. This was the price of leadership, not the glory or the power. This. Standing in a ruined clearing in the middle of nowhere, being asked to sacrifice the fragile peace you'd just found because other people needed you to be what you'd spent years trying to stop being. "I need time to think," Kaelen said. "We don't have time." Draven's voice was urgent. "Every hour we wait, Malrek consolidates power, executes more people, turns more houses against the possibility of your return. Then, give me 10 minutes. Kaelen's tone brooked no argument. "I just abdicated a throne to avoid becoming a tyrant. Before I pick it back up, I need to be certain I'm doing it for the right reasons." The captain hesitated, then nodded. 10 minutes. Then we need your answer." After Draven withdrew with his soldiers, Kaelen and Seraphine stood alone among the ancient stones. The ruins around them felt appropriate, remnants of empires that hadn't survived. Physical proof that power was temporary and civilizations were fragile. That everything eventually crumbled back to stone in memory. "Tell me honestly," Kaelen said into the silence. "Am I being noble or just arrogant? Thinking I'm the only one who can stop Malrek? Probably both." Seraphine sat on one of the fallen stones. "But that doesn't make you wrong. Malrek understands power. He'll respect someone who can match him. The Provisional Council can't. The noble houses can't. You're the only person left who speaks his language. By being worse than him. By being more strategic than him. There's a difference between cruelty and calculated force. Your father never understood that. Malrek doesn't either. But you do." Kaelen wanted to believe her. Wanted to think he could retake the throne without becoming the monster he'd just escaped from. But he'd seen too many good intentions twist into tyranny. Had lived through the slow corruption of believing the ends justified the means. What if I go back and can't stop? What if the power changes me again? Then we'll deal with that when it happens. Seraphine stood, moving to stand in front of him. But right now, 17 people are dead, and 30 more are waiting to die because Malrek is doing exactly what you used to do. Only worse, only without any of the restraint you developed. So I'm the lesser evil. You're the evil that learned to be less. That's not nothing. The words settled over Kaelen like a mantle. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Undeniable. He'd spent 10 years being the Alpha King, then hours learning to be human, Now he was being asked to be both simultaneously, to wear the crown while remembering what it felt like to take it off, to wield power while understanding its cost, to be the monster with full awareness of the monstrosity. That was the real test of redemption. Not walking away from power, but returning to it with eyes open and conscience intact. "If I do this," Kaelen said slowly, "I need promises from everyone involved." "What kind of promises?" "The kind that keep me accountable. Seraphine, you stay with me. Challenge me when I'm wrong. Remind me who I'm supposed to be when the crown starts feeling too comfortable." She nodded. "Done. Captain Draven and whatever council we form. They don't just follow orders. They question them, push back, force me to justify every decision. That'll be difficult." "Good. Difficult is better than easy obedience. Easy obedience is how tyrants happen." Kaelen took a breath, feeling the weight of what he was about to commit to. "And if I start becoming what I was, if the fear and paranoia and cruelty start returning, someone ends it, permanently. No hesitation." Seraphine's eyes widened. "You're asking someone to kill you. I'm asking someone to stop me from becoming the thing we're fighting against." Kaelen's voice was firm. "Because going back means risking everything I just learned. And I need to know that if I fail, if I become Malrek, there's a plan to prevent that from spreading." The request was insane. Was asking people to commit to regicide before he'd even retaken the throne. But it was also the only way Kaelen could live with himself while wearing the crown again. The only insurance policy against his own worst impulses. "All right," Seraphine said finally. "I promise." "You promise what?" "If you become what you were, I'll be the one who stops you, however necessary." The commitment should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like relief, like having someone care enough to save him from himself. Kaelen turned toward where Draven waited with the soldiers, made a decision that would either save an empire or damn his soul. "Captain," he called out, "I'm coming back." But not as the old king. As something different, Draven emerged from the tree line. "What does that mean?" "It means the Iron Wolf is dead. What returns to Varelion is someone who understands what that wolf cost." Kaelen's voice carried across the clearing with quiet authority. "Gather whoever stayed loyal. Send word to any houses that supported the abdication. Tell them Malrek's reign ends now." "And how exactly do we accomplish that?" The captain moved closer. "We're outnumbered, outpositioned, and have no strategic advantages. We have the one thing Malrek doesn't." Kaelen felt old instincts rising, felt the tactical mind that had won a dozen campaigns starting to map possibilities. "We have legitimacy. People might fear him, but they won't follow him. Not long term. He's a usurper holding power through terror. I'm a king who voluntarily surrendered and is returning by request. That's a political distinction, not a military advantage. It becomes a military advantage when we use it correctly." Kaelen moved to clear ground, sketching in the dirt with a stick. "Malrek is fortified in the palace. Direct assault is suicide. But he has to maintain supply lines, has to keep the city functioning, has to project power beyond the palace walls. So we cut him off." Seraphine understood immediately. "Blockade the palace, turn the city against him, make the fortress into a prison." "Exactly. Starve him of legitimacy and resources simultaneously. Make every day he holds power more expensive than the last." Draven studied the crude map taking shape in the dirt. That requires controlling the city, the garrison, the noble houses, which we get by proving we're not here to reconquer. Kaelen looked up, meeting the captain's eyes. "Send envoys to every house, every guild, every power structure in the capital. Tell them the same thing. The old regime is over. This is about stopping one tyrant, not reinstalling another." "And when we win, when Malrek is defeated?" Draven's voice carried skepticism. "Do you really think you'll give up power a second time?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Kaelen stood, dropping the stick. "I don't know. That's the honest answer. I don't know if I'm strong enough to put the crown down twice. But I know I'm not strong enough to live with myself if I don't try." It was the most vulnerable admission of his life, more honest than any speech from a throne, more genuine than a decade of calculated leadership. And somehow, it was also the most powerful thing he'd ever said. Because real strength isn't pretending you're invincible. It's admitting you're breakable and choosing courage anyway. Riven studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, we follow you. One more time. Not follow. Work with. There's a difference. The captain smiled slightly. We'll see if you remember that when things get difficult. They move fast after that. Riven's soldiers formed escort as they headed back toward the capital. Word was sent ahead through networks of loyal servants and minor nobles, quiet messages that rippled through the city like spreading fire. The old king returns, not for power, for justice. Kaelen felt the weight settling over him with each mile, felt the crown he'd surrendered becoming real again, felt himself transforming from refugee to commander, the Alpha King rising from the ashes of the man who'd walked away. But different this time. Tempered by failure. Informed by loss. Carrying the memory of what it felt like to be human without the armor of absolute authority. That memory would be his anchor, his reminder, his insurance against becoming what he was fighting, if he was strong enough to hold on to it. They reached the outskirts of Varelion by nightfall. The city looked different from this angle. Not the gleaming jewel he'd ruled, but a scarred landscape of burned districts and fortified positions. Malric had been busy. Checkpoints, patrols, public executions visible even from a distance. The Empire eating itself. Again. Riven's scouts reported back with intelligence. Malric held the palace and central district with roughly 800 soldiers. Maybe 1,000 if you counted impressed civilians and opportunistic mercenaries. The rest of the city was fragmented. Some districts were openly hostile to the new regime. Others were fearfully compliant. Most were just trying to survive. Classic power vacuum. Everyone grabbing for whatever stability they could find. Kaelen set up temporary command in an abandoned manor on the eastern edge. Not ideal, but defensible. Close enough to act, far enough to avoid immediate detection. The first noble houses arrived within hours. Minor families at first, testing whether this was real or just another power play. Kaelen met with them personally. No throne, no elevated position, just eye-level conversations in a dusty room that smelled like abandonment. I'm not here to reconquer, he told them. Each group got the same message. I'm here to stop someone worse than I was. If you support that goal, we work together. If not, you're free to leave. No consequences. The honesty was disarming. These nobles had spent years navigating Kaelen's court politics, learning to read threats and calculate survival. They didn't know how to respond to transparency. Some left, unwilling to trust the Alpha King's transformation, convinced this was elaborate manipulation. But others stayed, cautiously, skeptically, willing to gamble that change was possible. By midnight, Kaelen had commitments from 12 noble houses, small ones mostly. Not enough to match Malric's force directly, but enough to begin building something. More importantly, word was spreading. Servants talked, merchants whispered, soldiers shared stories. The narrative was shifting from tyrant returning to vengeful king to something more complicated. Man trying to fix what he broke. Leader accepting consequences while stopping someone worse. It wasn't redemption, but it was momentum. Lord Theron arrived before dawn with another 100 soldiers. The old commander looked exhausted but grimly satisfied. Took me 6 hours to convince garrison commanders you weren't planning another tyranny, he reported. But once they understood this was temporary, they committed. Define temporary. Kaelen studied maps spread across the makeshift command table. Until Malric falls and a proper transitional government forms. Theron's look was pointed. You're not staying on the throne. We're clear on that. Crystal clear. The commander nodded. Good. Because the moment you look like you're trying to hold power permanently, half these soldiers will turn on you faster than Malric's loyalists. Understood. Seraphine entered carrying reports from scouts. Malric knows you're here. He's fortifying the palace, calling up reinforcements from houses that support him. How long before he moves against us? Kaelen asked. Theron studied the intelligence. He won't. He's smart enough to know that attacking first makes him the aggressor. He'll let you come to him. Fight from fortified positions. Make you pay for every inch. Then we don't give him what he expects. Kaelen traced routes on the map. We don't attack the palace. We isolate it. Control everything around it. Turn his fortress into his tomb. That takes time we might not have. Then we'd better move fast. The plan took shape through the night. Coordinated. Brutal. Designed to strangle Malric's position without direct confrontation. Seize control of food supplies. Block water access. Cut communication lines. Turn the palace from symbol of power into isolated cage. Siege warfare. The long game. Death by 1,000 cuts instead of one decisive battle. It was strategically sound, politically smart, exactly the kind of calculated approach that had won Kaelen an empire. But it was also slow, and every day meant more executions, more people dying while Kaelen played tactical chess. The old tension rising. Strategy versus morality. Effective versus right. Kaelen pushed the maps away, suddenly exhausted. We implement the plan at dawn. Coordinate with all allied houses. Begin establishing perimeter control. Your Majesty, Captain Draven hesitated over the title. There's one more thing. Malrek has hostages. Noble families who supported your abdication. He's threatening to execute them if you advance. How many? 23 confirmed. Probably more we don't know about. The information hit like cold water. Of course Malrek had hostages. It was the oldest play in the book. Insurance against aggression. Kaelen had used the same tactic dozens of times. If we advance, they die, Seraphine said quietly. If we wait, they die eventually anyway, when he decides they're no longer useful. So there's no good option. Kaelen felt familiar weight pressing down. Just degrees of terrible. We could negotiate, Theron suggested. Offer prisoner exchange. Malrek won't negotiate. He's not trying to win diplomatically. He's trying to prove strength through cruelty. Kaelen recognized the strategy because he'd invented it. Hostages aren't leverage, they're message. Attack me and watch innocents die. So what do we do? Draven demanded. Here's what separates leadership from tyranny. Tyrants make decisions and force others to live with consequences. Leaders make decisions and carry those consequences themselves. Kaelen couldn't save everyone, couldn't implement a perfect strategy with zero casualties. The hostages were leveraged precisely because they mattered. But refusing to act because people might die just guaranteed Malrek would kill them anyway. Eventually. When they stopped being useful. Sometimes the only choices available were terrible and worse. We advance, Kaelen said quietly. Implement the siege, isolate the palace, and if Malrek executes hostages, that blood is on my hands. I'll carry it. Not you, not anyone else. Me. Your Majesty. Theron started. No. Kaelen's voice was firm. I'm taking responsibility. That's the difference between what I was and what I'm trying to be. The old king would have blamed Malrek, would have used the deaths as justification for escalation. I'm saying clearly that every decision I make costs lives, and I won't hide from that truth. The room went silent. Seraphine was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read, something between horror and respect. You're going to torture yourself with this, she said softly. Probably, but that's better than not caring. The words hung in the air like epitaph and promise. They moved at dawn, coordinated teams securing key positions throughout the city, granaries, wells, market squares, every point that supplied the palace with resources. Malrek's forces responded exactly as predicted, fortified harder, pulled in tighter, turned the palace into an island surrounded by hostile territory, and then began executing hostages. One every 2 hours. Public displays in the central plaza where everyone could see. The message was clear. Defy me and innocents die. Kaelen watched from the Eastern District command post, binoculars pressed to his eyes, as the fourth execution took place. A young noble, maybe 20. Guilty of nothing except having a family that supported abdication, hanged in front of a crowd forced to bear witness. Kaelen felt each death like a knife between his ribs, felt the weight accumulating, felt himself being tested in ways combat never managed. Because killing enemies was easy, soldiers understood that risk. But watching innocent people die because of your strategic decisions? That was what kept you awake at night. What made you question whether leadership was worth the cost? Your Majesty, Captain Draven approached carefully. The siege is working. Malrek's supplies are dwindling. Another 3 days and he'll be desperate enough to negotiate. 3 days. Kaelen lowered the binoculars. How many more hostages die in 3 days? At this rate? 14. Maybe more. 14 lives. 14 people who would die because Kaelen had chosen long-game strategy over immediate action. 14 names he would carry forever. There has to be another way, Seraphine said behind him. There isn't. Theron's voice was grim. Direct assault costs hundreds. The siege costs dozens. Terrible mathematics, but clear. Unless, Kaelen turned from the window, mind working. Unless we change the equation entirely. What do you mean? What if instead of sieging the palace, we extract the hostages? Kaelen moved to the maps. Malrek is fortified against external attack. But internal rescue? Surgical strike? That's different. That's suicide. Theron shook his head. The palace has been your fortress for a decade. You designed those defenses. No one gets in without being detected. I did. Kaelen's finger traced paths on the map. The old smuggling tunnels, the ones my father used for moving mistresses in and out. I sealed most of them, but a few still connect to the lower dungeons. Those tunnels are probably guarded or collapsed. Probably, but probably isn't certainly. Kaelen looked up. If there's even a chance we can extract hostages without triggering mass execution, isn't that worth attempting? The room went quiet. Everyone understood what he was really suggesting. A desperate gambit, high risk, low probability of success. The kind of move only a fool or someone with nothing left to lose would attempt. I'll do it, Kaelen said into the silence. Small team, in and out before Malrek realizes what's happening. Absolutely not. Draven stepped forward. You're the entire reason this operation has legitimacy. If you die in a failed rescue attempt, everything collapses. Then I'd better not die. Your Majesty, this isn't strategy. This is guilt-driving reckless action. Maybe. Kaelen didn't deny it. But it's also the right thing. Those people are hostages because they believed I could change, because they supported my abdication. I owe them more than slow starvation while I play siege warfare. Seraphine was watching him with that penetrating stare. You're trying to prove you're different than what you were. I'm trying to be worth the second chance people gave me. By risking everything on a rescue mission that probably can't succeed? By trying. That's the point. The old king would have calculated acceptable losses and moved on. I can't do that anymore. Can't treat people as numbers on strategic maps. Even if it means losing? Especially then. Kaelen's voice was quiet but firm. Because that's what makes this different, what makes me different. I'm willing to fail trying to do right instead of succeed by doing wrong. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Theron sighed heavily. If you're doing this insanity, you're not going alone. I'm coming. Captain Draven nodded reluctantly. As am I. Someone needs to keep you from dying stupidly. Seraphine stepped forward. Don't even think about leaving me behind. This isn't your fight, Kaelen protested. Everything that happens in that palace is my fight. Her voice was steel. I helped create this situation. I'm helping resolve it. One by one, others volunteered. Soldiers who'd stayed loyal, minor nobles who wanted to prove allegiance. By the time planning finished, Kaelen had a team of 12. Not enough to fight Malrek's full force, but maybe enough for surgical extraction if luck held. Big if. They prepared through the day, gathering intelligence on hostage locations, mapping tunnel routes, coordinating timing with the ongoing siege to mask their insertion. As sunset approached, Kaelen stood in the abandoned manor looking at maps he'd designed decades ago. The palace he'd called home for 10 years. The fortress he'd transformed into a symbol of absolute power. Now he was breaking into it like a thief. The irony wasn't lost on him. Seraphine found him there as dusk fell. You're having second thoughts. Third and fourth thoughts. Kaelen didn't look away from the maps. This could end with all of us dead and Malrek still holding the hostages. It could. She moved beside him, or it could end with 14 people surviving who would have died otherwise. That's optimistic. I've learned from someone who's trying to believe better outcomes are possible. Kaelen smiled despite the tension. When did you become hopeful? When I watched an Alpha King choose vulnerability over invincibility. She touched his arm. You don't have to do this. No one would blame you for choosing the strategic option. I would blame me. That's enough. They stood together as darkness fell over the city, over the empire that was tearing itself apart again, over the palace where innocent people waited to die. And Kaelen made peace with the reality that this might be his last night alive, that trying to be better than what he'd been might cost him everything. But that was the price of transformation, not just changing when it was convenient, but holding on to that change when it became expensive, when the easy path was right there and choosing differently meant risking death. The team assembled after full dark, 12 people dressed in dark clothing, armed with whatever weapons they could quietly carry. No armor, no banners, nothing that would identify them as anything except desperate fighters. Kaelen looked at each face, memorized them. These people were risking everything because they believed in the possibility that he'd actually changed. He couldn't let them down. "If we do this right, we're in and out before Malrek knows we're there," Kaelen said quietly. "If it goes wrong, scatter. No heroic last stands. Survival trumps victory. And if you're captured," Theron asked, "then I'm captured. But the rest of you escape. That's an order." The old commander smiled grimly. "Haven't followed your orders in years, not starting now." They moved through darkened streets toward the eastern wall where the old tunnels connected. The city was quiet, tense, holding its breath waiting for the next crisis. Above them, the palace loomed against the night sky, windows blazing with light, guards visible on battlements, Malrek's fortress, Kaelen's former home, the place where everything had started and might finally end. They reached the tunnel entrance hidden behind a collapsed storehouse. Kaelen knelt, brushing away years of debris and overgrowth. The entrance was still there, sealed with an iron grate but intact. Draven and 2 soldiers worked to remove the grate. Metal grinding against stone echoed too loudly in the quiet night. Finally it gave way, revealing darkness that smelled of damp earth and forgotten secrets. One by one, they descended into the blackness, into the tunnels beneath the palace, into the desperate gamble that would either save innocent lives or kill everyone foolish enough to try. Kaelen went last, looked back at the city one final time, at the empire he'd built and broken and was now trying to save from someone worse than himself. Then he climbed into darkness and pulled the grate closed behind him, sealing his fate and the fate of everyone who'd chosen to follow the fallen king one last time. The darkness beneath the palace was absolute. Kaelen moved through tunnels he'd last walked 15 years ago, when his father had shown him the secret passages as part of royal education. Back then, these corridors had seemed like adventure, passages for intrigue and romance, and the kind of power that operated in shadows. Now they felt like a tomb. Water dripped somewhere in the distance. The air was thick with mold and decay. Every footstep echoed despite their attempts at silence, amplified by stone walls that had stood for centuries. Behind Kaelen, the team moved in single file. 12 people trusting him to navigate passages that might have collapsed or been sealed or led them straight into Malrek's hands. The weight of that trust felt heavier than any crown. They reached the first junction after 20 minutes of careful movement. Kaelen paused, trying to remember the layout from decades-old memory. Left led to the wine cellars, right to the servant quarters, straight to the dungeons where hostages were likely held. Straight meant the highest risk but the most direct path. Kaelen gestured forward. The team followed without question. Here's what years of leadership teach you. People don't follow strategies. They follow certainty. Even when you're terrified and improvising and have no idea if your plan will work, projecting confidence matters more than actually being confident. Fake it until everyone's dead or everyone survives. Those are the only outcomes that matter. They moved deeper into the palace infrastructure, past ancient foundations, through passages that predated the current structure. Places where empire was built on older empires, layer after layer of civilization trying to outlast time. All of them eventually failing. The thought should have been depressing. Instead, it was strangely comforting. Kaelen's empire was just one more in a long line of temporary power structures. His failures were just echoes of failures stretching back centuries. Nothing was permanent. Not power, not tyranny, not even redemption. Just the attempt to be better than what came before. That was the only legacy that mattered. Captain Draven moved up beside him. "We're getting close to the dungeon level. Guards will be heavier here. Then we move carefully." Kaelen drew the short blade he'd been given. "No killing unless necessary. We're here for extraction, not revenge. Understood?" They ascended through a narrow stairwell that opened into a storage room filled with old furniture and forgotten equipment. Dust thick enough to track footprints. No one had been here in years. Kaelen cracked the door, peering into the corridor beyond. Empty, but he could hear voices. Guards talking somewhere around the corner, casual conversation that meant they weren't expecting threats. Why would they? They were inside Malrek's fortress, behind multiple layers of security. No one was stupid enough to infiltrate the palace, except a fallen king with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Kaelen signaled the team. They moved through the storage room into the corridor, pressing against walls, avoiding sight lines. Professional. Discipline. The kind of coordination that came from soldiers who'd fought together. They reached the dungeon entrance to find 2 guards stationed outside. Young men, barely 20, probably recruited from the city garrison with promises of power and position in Malrek's new order. They never saw Kaelen coming. He moved like the warrior he'd been before becoming king, fast, silent, brutal efficiency. One guard went down with a blow to the temple. The other got Theron's knife pommel to the back of the head, both unconscious before they could raise alarm. The team dragged them into shadows, binding and gagging them. Kaelen took keys from the first guard's belt. Beyond the door, stairs descended into darkness punctuated by torchlight. The dungeons proper, where his father had kept enemies and Kaelen had continued the tradition, where Malrek now kept hostages as leverage. They descended carefully, each step measured, listening for movement, watching for guards. The dungeon level opened into a central chamber with cells radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. Design intended for maximum security and minimum privacy. Prisoners could be monitored from a single position. That position was currently occupied by 4 guards sitting around a table playing cards. Kaelen assessed quickly. 4 targets. Alert but not vigilant. Armed but not armored. Overconfident because they assumed no threats could reach this deep. He signaled the team. Spread formation. Simultaneous engagement. No one gets to sound alarm. They moved as one. Kaelen took the guard closest to the alarm bell. Seized him from behind, hand over mouth, blade pressed to throat. Not cutting, just threatening. Around the room, his team duplicated the action. 4 guards subdued in seconds. Weapons removed, hands bound, not a single alarm raised. Sometimes violence is necessary, but unnecessary violence is just cruelty wearing efficiency's mask. The old Kaelen would have killed these guards without hesitation. The man he was becoming understood that unconscious prisoners served the same purpose as dead ones, with fewer corpses haunting his sleep. "Where are the political prisoners?" Kaelen demanded quietly. The guard he held shook with terror. "North Wing, cells 12 through 24. How many more guards?" 6. Maybe 8. "Rotating patrols every 20 minutes. Kaelen glanced at the others. "We have less than 20 minutes. Move fast but careful. Extract everyone who wants to leave. No one gets left behind who's willing to come." "What about ones who refuse?" Seraphine asked. "We note their location for later rescue attempts, but we don't force anyone. That's what Malrek does." The team split into extraction groups. Kaelen led the way to the north wing, keys jingling softly as he moved between cells. The first prisoner was a young woman, minor nobility from a house that had supported abdication. She looked up as Kaelen opened her cell, eyes widening in recognition. "Your Majesty?" "Not anymore. Just someone trying to fix his mistakes. Can you walk?" She nodded, too shocked to speak. "Then come." Quietly, cell after cell, prisoner after prisoner. Some recognized Kaelen and hesitated, torn between hope and fear that this was elaborate torture. Others just stumbled out, desperate for any chance at freedom. By the time they'd cleared the north wing, Kaelen had 17 freed hostages and a growing problem. 17 people moving through dungeons were 17 times more likely to be detected than 12 trained soldiers. Add in exhaustion, injury, and trauma, and the mathematics of escape became exponentially worse. "We won't all make it back through the tunnels," Theron said quietly what everyone was thinking. "Then we find another way." Kaelen refused to accept that he'd come this far just to abandon people to recapture. There are servant passages, old evacuation routes. This palace has more exits than entrances, all monitored by Malrek's forces. Not all. Not the ones my father kept secret even from his own guard. Kaelen led them through the dungeon's eastern section, toward passages he'd discovered as a child while exploring forbidden areas. Routes designed for royal family to escape in case of coup or siege. Routes that might still be functional if luck held. They were halfway there when the alarm bells started ringing. Someone had discovered the unconscious guards, discovered missing prisoners, realized the palace had been breached. Malrek would lock down every exit, flood corridors with soldiers, turn the entire structure into a trap designed to catch exactly the kind of desperate rescue Kaelen had attempted. "Run," Kaelen ordered. "Forget stealth. Just move." They ran through stone corridors while alarm bells echoed behind them, ran past startled servants and through storage rooms and across courtyards where guards were mobilizing. Some guards recognized Kaelen and hesitated. That half-second of confusion bought precious distance. Others saw an enemy and attacked without question. Kaelen fought as he ran. Blade work reduced to efficiency. Block, strike, move. Don't stop to finish fights. Just create space and keep the hostages moving. Seraphine fought beside him with improvised weapons. A serving tray. A broken chair leg. Whatever came to hand. She fought like someone who'd spent years learning that survival meant adapting. Behind them, hostages stumbled and ran and helped each other. 17 people who'd faced execution now running toward impossible freedom. The evacuation passage was hidden behind a tapestry in the old king's study. Kaelen tore through the study door, guards close behind, and ripped the tapestry aside. The passage entrance was still there, still functional. "Get them out," he ordered Draven. "Everyone. Now." "And you?" the captain demanded. "I'm buying time." Kaelen turned to face the approaching guards. "Someone has to hold this doorway long enough for extraction. That's suicide." "Probably. But those 17 people didn't survive captivity just to die in a hallway chase." He looked at Seraphine. "Make sure they get out. I'm not leaving you." "Yes, you are." Kaelen's voice was firm but gentle. "Because if I die here, someone needs to tell the story. Someone needs to make sure people know this wasn't about reconquest. It was about trying to be better than what I was." Her eyes filled with tears. "You're an idiot." "I know, but I'm an idiot who finally figured out what actually matters." Before she could argue, Kaelen pushed her toward the passage. Theron grabbed her, pulling her into the evacuation route despite her protests. The last thing Kaelen saw before the passage sealed was her face. Storm-colored eyes looking back at him with expression that held everything they'd never had time to say. Then stone slid shut and he was alone. Guards flooded into the study seconds later. 20 soldiers, maybe more, all armed, all angry, all converging on a single man holding a doorway with nothing but a short blade and a decade of combat experience. Here's what you learn after ruling through fear. Intimidation is about presentation. Make yourself bigger, more dangerous. Create the impression that attacking you costs more than the potential gain. Kaelen stood at the sealed passage entrance and became the Alpha King one final time. Not the tyrant, not the cruel ruler. The warrior who'd won an empire through force of will and refusal to break. "First guard who comes close dies," he said quietly. "Second probably survives but loses something important. Hand, eye, doesn't matter which. After that, odds favor you heavily. But those first two? They're pain and blood." The guards hesitated. They had overwhelming numbers. They'd win eventually, but eventually wasn't the same as immediately. And no one wanted to be first or second. The standoff held for 5 seconds. 10. 15. Then a voice cut through the tension. "Stand down." The guards parted, and Lord Malrek walked into the study, looking exactly as he had in the council chambers. Cultured, controlled, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength. Kaelen Draven. The former advisor smiled. "I wondered when you'd make your move. Should have known you'd try something theatrically stupid. Stupid would be thinking you can hold power through terror indefinitely." Kaelen didn't lower his weapon. Eventually the fear breaks down. Eventually people get tired of being afraid, says the man who ruled exactly that way for a decade. Says the man who learned that lesson the hard way. Kaelen met Malrek's eyes. "You can kill me." "Probably will. But those hostages are gone. Your leverage disappeared, and every second I keep you talking is another second they get farther away." Malrek's expression flickered, anger behind the control. "You freed 17 people. I can execute 100 more. Can you save them all? No. But I can save some, and some is better than none. That's not strategy. That's sentiment. It's also the difference between us." Kaelen straightened despite exhaustion and the knowledge that these were probably his last moments alive. "You think power is about control, about fear. about making people too terrified to resist. I thought that once too. But real power is about giving people something worth fighting for instead of just something to fear. Pretty philosophy from a man who's about to die. Maybe. But I'll die knowing I chose better instead of succeeding at worse. Can you say the same? The question hung in the air between them. Malric studied Kaelen for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. You know what's frustrating about you? You actually mean it. You're not playing politics. You genuinely believe this redemption narrative. It would be pathetic if it wasn't so dangerous. Dangerous to what? To the entire concept of how power works. Malric's smile disappeared. You're trying to prove that rulers can change, that tyranny isn't inevitable, that fear-based governance can be replaced with something better. If you succeed, if people actually believe it's possible, you undermine every power structure that's kept empires functioning for centuries. Good. Kaelen's voice was quiet. Those structures needed undermining. The advisor shook his head. You don't understand what you're dismantling. Fear is efficient. It's clear. It works. Your compassion will get thousands killed when the empire fragments because no one's afraid enough to maintain order. Or it'll give them something worth building instead of just something to obey. Malric gestured to the guards. Take him. Alive if possible, dead if necessary. Before the guards could move, an explosion rocked the palace. Then another, closer. Then the sound Kaelen had been hoping for. The sound of his siege forces launching final assault while the palace was distracted with internal breach. Coordinated attack. Internal and external simultaneously. Designed to split Malric's attention and create exactly this kind of chaos. Kaelen had planned it before entering the tunnels. Had given orders that if he wasn't out within 2 hours, Theron would assault the palace with everything they had. Suicide mission turned distraction. Distraction turned full assault. Strategy within strategy. The old Alpha King's mind still working even when pretending to be selflessly heroic. Maybe he'd never fully escape what he'd been. Maybe the tactical, calculating, survival-focused core was permanent. The question was whether he could use those instincts for better purposes. Malric's expression turned murderous. You planned this. I planned to extract hostages. Everything after that was improvisation based on likely responses. Kaelen smiled grimly. You're not the only one who understands multi-layered strategy. Guards, Malric snapped. Forget him. Defend the palace. We can execute one failed king after we've crushed his pathetic assault. The soldiers rushed out, leaving Kaelen and Malric alone in the study. Two men who'd both understood power, who'd both used fear as weapon, who'd both convinced themselves that cruelty was necessary for survival. The difference was one of them had learned to stop. You can't win, Malric said. My forces outnumber yours. I hold the palace. I have the high ground and fortified positions. You're right. Kaelen lowered his blade slightly. I probably can't win militarily, but I don't have to. I just have to prove that trying matters more than succeeding. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. It's also why you'll lose. Because people don't follow certainty. They follow hope. And right now, I represent the hope that empires can be better than what we've made them. Hope doesn't hold territory. No. But it undermines the will to fight for tyranny. Your soldiers are out there wondering why they're defending a usurper against a king who voluntarily gave up power. My soldiers are fighting because they believe change is possible. Guess which motivation lasts longer? Malric moved toward his desk, hand sliding toward a drawer where Kaelen knew weapons were kept. Kaelen was faster, crossed the distance in 3 steps. Blade at Malric's throat before the drawer opened. Don't, Kaelen said quietly. I don't want to kill you, but I will if I have to. Finally, Malric smiled despite the blade. There's the Alpha King, the real you underneath all this redemption theater. You're still the same man who built an empire on corpses. No. Kaelen's voice was steady. The old me would have killed you the moment I entered this room, would have executed you publicly as a message. The man I'm trying to be understands that killing you just proves your point about power requiring violence. So what's your alternative? Imprisonment? Trial? You think the Provisional Council will show mercy? I think they'll show justice, which is different from mercy and different from revenge. Kaelen stepped back slightly, giving Malric space but keeping his weapon ready. You orchestrated betrayal, executed innocents, tried to sell the empire to foreign powers. Those crimes have consequences, but consequences decided by law, not by one man's anger. And if I refuse to surrender? If I'd rather die fighting than face trial? Kaelen hesitated. This was the moment. The test of whether his transformation was real or just performance. Then I'll give you a soldier's death, quick, honorable. Not the public spectacle you gave your victims. Malrek stared at him. You mean that? I do. Why? Because becoming better means being better even to people who don't deserve it. That's the point. That's what separates justice from revenge. Kaelen lowered his blade entirely. So choose. Surrender and face trial. Or die here. But choose quickly because my soldiers are tearing through your defenses and I need to stop them before this becomes a massacre. The advisor studied him for a long moment. Then he laughed. Bitter, defeated, genuine. You actually changed. I thought it was manipulation, but you really did become something different. He moved to the window overlooking the courtyard where fighting raged. That's either the most inspiring thing I've ever seen or the most tragic. Can it be both? I suppose. Malrek turned back. You know what's worst about this? You're probably right. About power. About fear. About everything I spent years perfecting. And I hate that you're right because it means I wasted my life building something that couldn't last. You didn't waste it. You learned what doesn't work. That's valuable too. The advisor smiled sadly. You're trying to redeem me along with yourself. Just trying to understand that we're all products of the systems we inherit. You learned from my father. I learned from you. We're all just echoing patterns until someone breaks the cycle. And you think you're the one who breaks it? I think I'm trying. That's the most anyone can do. Malrek moved to his desk, pulled out not a weapon, but papers. Treaties. Strategic documents. Everything he'd compiled while orchestrating the conspiracy. These are yours. Names of everyone involved, payments made, promises given, everything you need to untangle the mess I created. He held them out. Kaelen took them carefully. This makes you a collaborator. Might reduce your sentence. I'm not doing it for mercy. Malrek's voice was quiet. I'm doing it because you're right. This empire deserves better than what we made it, and maybe helping you fix it is the only redemption I'll get. The moment was interrupted by Theron bursting through the door, sword drawn and blood spattered. Your Majesty, we've secured the eastern wing. Malrek's forces are surrendering. He stopped, seeing Malrek standing calmly beside Kaelen. He's surrendering. Kaelen gestured with the papers. And providing intelligence on the conspiracy. Take him to secure holding, not the dungeons. Somewhere with light and decent conditions. Your Majesty, he's responsible for... I know what he's responsible for. That's why there'll be a trial. But we're better than summary execution. We're better than what we were. Theron looked between them, then nodded slowly. As you command. As we agree, Kaelen corrected gently. I'm not commanding anymore. I'm asking. The distinction mattered more than strategy or tactics or any of the 1,000 calculations that had defined his rule. This was what transformation looked like. Not grand gestures, but small moments where you chose differently. Where you treated enemies as humans and requested instead of demanded. Where you recognized that power was temporary, but how you wielded it echoed forever. After Malrek was led away, Kaelen stood in the study that had been his father's and briefly his own. Stood surrounded by the trappings of power he'd abandoned and been forced to reclaim. Seraphine found him there an hour later. The hostages were safe. The palace was secured. Fighting had stopped with Malrek's surrender and the revelation of the conspiracy's full scope. The crisis was over. But the real work was just beginning. You did it, she said softly. You actually saved them. We saved them. Kaelen gestured at nothing. All of us together. That's the lesson. One person can't hold an empire. Not sustainably. It requires collaboration. Trust. Things I forgot while convinced that control was the same as leadership. So what happens now? Now we do the hardest thing. We build something better from the ruins of what failed. Kaelen moved to the window overlooking the city. Dawn was breaking over Varelion, light touching damaged buildings and burned districts, illuminating both destruction and the people beginning to rebuild. The Provisional Council will need to be expanded, he said quietly. Include representatives from all regions, not just nobility. Merchants, craftsmen, people who actually understand how daily life works. You're designing a government without a king. I'm designing a government that doesn't require one. Kaelen smiled slightly. Because the greatest tyranny isn't a bad ruler. It's a system that requires a good ruler to function. If it only works when you have someone competent and moral at the top, then it's fundamentally broken. Seraphine moved beside him, shoulder touching his. And when the council is established, when the transition is complete, what happens to the fallen king? He goes into exile like he promised. Kaelen's voice was certain. I meant what I said. I'm not staying. The Empire needs to learn it can function without me, needs to stop depending on one person to hold it together. Where will you go? Somewhere quiet. Somewhere I can spend years trying to make peace with what I did while wearing that crown. He looked at her. What about you? What about, I thought I'd come with you. If you'll have me. Her voice was soft. Someone needs to make sure you actually follow through on all this transformation instead of just brooding dramatically in exile. Kaelen felt something in his chest crack. Not break. Open. You're serious? Completely. I spent years plotting revenge, months orchestrating downfall, days watching you choose better over easier. She took his hand. I'm not walking away from that just because the dramatic part is over. The real work is what comes after. Building instead of destroying. Exactly. They stood together watching sunrise over an empire that had broken and was slowly rebuilding, watching people emerge from hiding and begin the difficult work of recovery. The Provisional Council met at midday. Kaelen attended not as king but as advisor, sat with the other representatives and provided input when asked, shared intelligence from Malrek's documents, helped identify conspirators and traitors, but he didn't command, didn't demand, just participated in the collaborative process of building governance from the ground up. It was messier than autocracy, slower, required endless negotiation and compromise. It was also far more stable, because decisions made by consensus had buy-in, had shared ownership, had people invested in success instead of just obeying orders. This is what democracy looks like, Duke Farron said during a heated debate about taxation policy. Chaos and argument, and somehow arriving at solutions no single person would have designed. It's beautiful, Kaelen agreed, and terrifying, and exactly what the Empire needs. The Council voted to officially dissolve the monarchy, transform Varelion into a republic governed by elected representatives. It would take years to implement fully, would require new laws and institutions and the kind of cultural shift that couldn't be forced. But it was possible. For the first time in centuries, it was genuinely possible. Kaelen's abdication was formalized 3 days later, not through surrender or defeat, but through ceremony that honored what the position had been while celebrating what it would become. No more kings, no more absolute power, no more empire built on the foundation of one person's will, just a nation trying to build something better from the ashes of what had failed. The night before his exile began, Kaelen walked through the palace one final time. Through throne rooms and council chambers, past portraits of kings stretching back generations, men who'd ruled and conquered and died, convinced their power was permanent, all of them forgotten except as names in historical texts. Kaelen stopped in front of his own portrait, painted 5 years ago at the height of his power. The artist had captured the Alpha King perfectly, cold, intimidating, absolutely certain of his authority. Looking at it now felt like looking at a stranger. That man was dead. Killed not by enemies, but by the slow recognition that everything he'd built was built wrong. That power without humanity was just another form of weakness. He left the portrait hanging, let future generations see what he'd been so they could understand what he'd chosen to stop being. Seraphine found him in the empty throne room near midnight. The Iron Throne sat abandoned. No one had claimed it. The council had voted to leave it empty as reminder, symbol of what they were moving away from. Ready? She asked. Kaelen looked at the throne one last time, felt nothing, no longing, no regret, just the quiet certainty that he was done carrying that weight. Ready. They left through the main gates as dawn broke. No ceremony, no fanfare, just two people walking away from power toward whatever came next. Behind them, the Empire of Varelion continued its transformation. Councils debated, citizens voted, systems slowly replaced the personal rule of kings with something more resilient. It wasn't perfect, would never be perfect, but perfect wasn't the goal. Better was the goal. And better was achievable. Theron and Captain Draven waited at the city limits with horses and supplies. "This is really it then," Theron said. "You're actually leaving." "I'm actually leaving." Kaelen clasped the old commander's arm. "Keep them honest. Push back when they start thinking power is the solution. Remind them what we learned, that fear doesn't build anything lasting." "Exactly." Draven stepped forward. "It's been an honor, Your Majesty. Even when you were terrible, you were honest about it. And when you changed, you meant it. That's rare. Thank you. For staying, for believing change was possible, for being better soldiers than I deserved." They rode north as the sun climbed, away from cities and politics and the weight of empire, toward forests and mountains and the kind of anonymity that let you rebuild yourself without the burden of history. After several hours, Seraphine broke the silence. "Do you regret it? Any of it?" Kaelen considered. "I regret the cruelty. The executions that served ego instead of justice. The years I spent convinced that fear was the same as respect. But not walking away. Not coming back when people needed me. Not trying to be better, even when being worse would have been easier." He looked at her. "Those things I'll carry forever, but as pride, not regret." She smiled. "You know what I realized?" "What?" "You spent a decade being the Alpha King, spent days learning to be human. Now you get to spend the rest of your life figuring out how to be both. Powerful enough to matter, human enough to care. That sounds exhausting. It sounds like the work of becoming who you're supposed to be instead of who you thought you had to be." They rode until evening brought them to a small village nestled in mountain foothills, places where Varelion's politics were distant concerns, where the fall of the Alpha King was just gossip from the capital, where two travelers could rest and start over. The innkeeper didn't recognize Kaelen, just saw a tired man with scarred hands and eyes that had seen too much. "Passing through or staying?" she asked. Kaelen looked at Seraphine, at the village, at the mountains rising beyond, at the possibility of building a life that wasn't defined by conquest or power or the weight of empire. "Staying," he said, "for a while at least." They took a small room overlooking the village square, watched people go about ordinary lives, merchants, craftsmen, families, all of them living without the drama of courts or the terror of tyranny, just existing, building, connecting. That night, Seraphine asked the question that had been unspoken since they left. "What do we do now?" Kaelen stood at the window watching stars emerge. "We live. We build something small and good instead of large and terrible. We prove that you can walk away from power and still matter, and when people eventually recognize you, when the legend catches up, then we deal with it. But until then, we're just two people trying to be better than our worst decisions." She moved beside him. Her hand found his. "Our worst decisions led us to each other. That has to count for something. It counts for everything." They stood together as darkness settled over the village, over the mountains, over the distant empire that was learning to function without kings, and Kaelen made peace with the truth that had taken him a decade to understand, that power was temporary, that fear was expensive, that cruelty was easy but compassion was strong, that being remembered as a conqueror meant nothing compared to being known as someone who chose better when choosing differently cost everything. The Alpha King was dead. In his place stood a man who'd learned that true strength wasn't domination. It was the courage to be vulnerable, to admit failure, to change when change was hard, to walk away from the throne because staying would have meant losing himself. That was the real victory. Not military conquest or strategic brilliance, just the quiet triumph of choosing humanity over power when the choice mattered most. Outside, the village slept peacefully. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled at the moon. Not iron wolves, just creatures surviving in mountains that had outlasted empires. And Kaelen listened to those howls and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because the work was done. The work would never be done. Redemption wasn't a destination but a direction. 1,000 daily choices to be better, to do better, to remember that who you become matters more than what you conquer. But for tonight, in a small room in a forgotten village, with a woman who destroyed his empire and somehow saved his soul, Kaelen allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was worthy of the second chance he'd been given. The empire of Varelion would continue without him, would stumble and struggle and slowly learn that governance was collaboration, that power was temporary, that fear could build kingdoms, but only trust could sustain them. And somewhere in the northern mountains, a fallen king would watch that transformation from distance, would hope his sacrifice meant something, would pray that walking away taught a better lesson than staying ever could. Because that's what redemption looks like. Not perfect, not complete, just the ongoing attempt to become more than the worst thing you've ever done. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, finding someone willing to walk that difficult road beside you. Seraphine's breathing evened as she fell asleep. Kaelen remained awake longer, watching stars and thinking about empires and the strange mathematics of power and humanity. Thinking about how the greatest strength isn't refusing to break. It's choosing how you rebuild after breaking becomes inevitable. He'd broken. Completely. The Alpha King shattered by his own cruelty and the recognition that everything he'd built was built wrong. But from those pieces he was constructing something new, something smaller, something that would never command armies or inspire fear, but something human, something genuine, something worth more than 1,000 conquered kingdoms. That was the lesson. The hard truth that took an empire's worth of failure to learn. Power makes you mighty. Humanity makes you real, and real always outlasts mighty. Always. As dawn approached and new day promised new chances to be better, Kaelen finally slept. Not the sleep of kings in fortified palaces, the sleep of a man who'd carried weight for years and finally learned to set it down, who'd walked through fire and somehow emerged not unburned but transformed, scarred, changed, better. And in that transformation, found the only victory that actually mattered, the freedom to be human instead of invincible, vulnerable instead of feared, connected instead of isolated, free. The story of the Alpha King ended not with conquest, but with surrender. Not with victory, but with walking away. Not with glory, but with the quiet dignity of choosing better when better cost everything. And somewhere in the mountains, as morning light touched distant peaks, a new empire learned to govern itself. A man who'd once been king discovered what it meant to simply be alive, to start over, to build small, to love without armor, to live. That was the true resolution, not dramatic battle or final confrontation, just the ongoing work of being human in a world that constantly tempts you to be something else. The Iron Wolf was dead. In his place stood someone still learning, still failing, still trying, still human. And humanity, for all its flaws and failures and fundamental fragility, remained the only power worth having, the only legacy worth leaving, the only empire worth building. One day, one choice, one person at a time.